The first bullet shattered the lantern before anyone heard the shot. 3 men fell in the darkness that followed. Silent, precise, gone. The survivors scrambled for cover, their confidence evaporating into the Montana night. They'd come to kill a rancher, a nobody, an easy target. But as their leader clutched his bleeding shoulder, watching shadows move where no man should be, he understood the terrible truth. They hadn't cornered prey. They'd walked into a predator's den. And Elias Crow, the quiet man they'd dismissed as weak, was just getting started. Stay with me through this story until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The valley didn't have a name on any map. It existed in the forgotten spaces between civilization and wilderness, where the Montana frontier stretched into endless silence. The kind of place men passed through but never stayed. Too isolated, too harsh, too far from anything that mattered. Elias Crow had chosen it for exactly those reasons. His ranch sat at the valley's eastern edge, a modest collection of weathered structures that looked like they'd grown from the earth itself. The main house was single-story timber, built low and strong against the wind. A barn stood 30 yards south, its doors facing away from the prevailing weather. Corrals extended from there in careful geometry, each post driven deep and true. Everything functional, nothing wasted. Elias worked the land with methodical precision, rising before dawn and retiring after dark. He spoke to no one unless necessary, and when he did, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. His face was weathered leather stretched over sharp bones, his eyes the color of winter sky, pale, cold, and unreadable. The nearest town was Stillwater, population 200 and declining. It clung to existence 12 miles west, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a single main street that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church with a steeple that listed slightly north, and a sheriff's office that hadn't seen a real lawman in 3 years. Elias made the trip to Stillwater once a month for supplies. He'd arrive at dawn, conduct his business with minimal conversation, and be gone by noon. The townspeople had learned not to bother him with questions. He paid in cash, never haggled, and never caused trouble. "Strange fellow, that Crow," Martha Henderson told her husband one evening. She ran the general store and considered herself the town's unofficial chronicler of character. "Been coming here 8 months now, and I couldn't tell you a single thing about him beyond what he buys." "Maybe that's the point," George Henderson replied, not looking up from his ledger. "Man wants privacy. Let him have it. It's not natural. Everyone's got a story. Where's he from? What is he running from? Why here?" "Maybe he just likes the quiet." Martha sniffed. "Quiet's one thing. That man's not quiet. He's silent. There's a difference." She was right, though she didn't understand how right. Elias Crow wasn't running from anything. He was waiting for something. And in the spring of 1887, what he'd been waiting for finally arrived. The Garrett gang rode into Stillwater on a Tuesday morning, 7 riders strong and mean as rattlesnakes. They came from the south, their horses tired but their eyes sharp, scanning the town with the practiced assessment of predators evaluating prey. Jack Garrett led them. 32 years old, with dead black eyes and a reputation that stretched from Wyoming to Texas. He'd killed his first man at 15 and hadn't stopped since. The gang carried that reputation like armor. It opened doors, loosened tongues, and emptied pockets without a shot being fired. Usually. They tied their horses outside the saloon and walked in like they owned the place, which, in about 5 minutes, they effectively would. The bartender, a nervous man named Pete Collins, saw them coming and felt his stomach drop. He'd heard stories. Every frontier town had heard stories about the Garrett gang. "Whiskey," Jack Garrett said, not sitting. "The good stuff, and information." Pete's hand shook as he poured 7 glasses. "Information about what?" "Everything. Who runs this town? Who's got money? Who's got guns? Who's got courage?" Jack smiled, and it was like watching a skull grin. "And who's smart enough to know when they're beat?" The other patrons in the saloon, 3 ranchers and a traveling merchant, suddenly found intense interest in their drinks. Nobody looked up. Nobody moved. "Sheriff's office is empty," one of Garrett's men said from the window. "Has been for a while, looks like." "No law." Jack nodded slowly. That makes things simpler. Pete set the glasses on the bar. We're just simple folks here. Don't have much worth taking. We'll be the judge of that. Jack downed his whiskey, slammed the glass down. Everybody pays. Store owner, saloon keeper, ranchers, farmers. Everybody contributes to our, let's call it a protection fund. We keep you safe from trouble. What trouble? Pete asked, then immediately regretted it. Jack's smile widened. The trouble that happens when people don't pay. You understand? Pete understood. Everyone understood. It was the oldest game in the Frontier playbook. Extortion dressed up as protection, theft disguised as taxation. Over the next 3 days, the Garrett gang established their presence with brutal efficiency. They took over the saloon's back room as headquarters. They demanded payments from every business, 20% of monthly revenue, due on the first of each month. They made examples of those who hesitated. Tom Miller, who owned the blacksmith shop, tried to argue that 20% would ruin him. They burned his forge and broke his left hand. He paid. Sarah Chen, who ran a small restaurant, tried to hide her cash box. They found it, took everything, and told her next month's payment was doubled for the deception. She paid. The pattern was clear. Resistance meant pain. Compliance meant survival. Most people chose survival. But on the fourth day, when two of Garrett's men, brothers named Cole and Wade Hutchins, rode out to the Eastern Valley to collect from the quiet rancher everyone called Crow, the pattern broke. Elias saw them coming from a mile away. Two riders, moving with the casual arrogance of men who'd never met real resistance. He continued his work, mending a section of fence near the barn, his movements unhurried. The Hutchins brothers rode right up to the fence line, their horses snorting and stamping. You, Crow? Cole asked. He was the older brother, 26, with a scraggly beard and tobacco-stained teeth. Elias drove another nail into the fence post, then looked up. I am. We're here on behalf of Mr. Jack Garrett. He's established a protection arrangement in Stillwater. Since you do business there, that includes you. I don't need protection, Wade laughed. He was younger, meaner, with quick eyes and quicker fists. Everybody needs protection, old man. Question is whether they're smart enough to pay for it before they need it. Elias studied them both with those pale winter eyes. How much? 20% of whatever you make. Monthly payment due on the 1st. And if I refuse? Cole's hand dropped to his revolver. Then we make sure you understand the benefits of cooperation. Elias set down his hammer carefully. He didn't touch his own gun, a well-maintained Colt .45 holstered at his right hip, but his body language shifted in a way both brothers registered without fully understanding. It was subtle, like watching a door lock or a trap spring. I'll give you a counteroffer, Elias said quietly. You ride back to Stillwater. You tell Garrett this land is not part of his territory. You forget you came here. Wade's laugh was louder this time. Or what? Or you'll wish you had. The brothers exchanged glances. This was unexpected. Everyone else in the territory had folded immediately. This skinny rancher with his quiet voice and cold eyes, he should be terrified. But he stood there like he was discussing the weather. Old man, Cole said slowly, I think you don't understand the situation. We're not asking, we're telling. You pay, or we hurt you. Simple as that. Elias's expression didn't change. You should leave now. Wade's temper snapped. He wasn't used to being dismissed, wasn't used to farmers standing up to him. He swung down from his saddle, his hand on his gun. You want to see how this goes? Because I'm happy to show you. He never finished the sentence. Later, Wade couldn't explain exactly what happened. One moment he was standing, hand on his weapon, ready to teach this fool a lesson. The next moment the world inverted. He was airborne, then crashing into the dirt hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. His gun was gone. His pride was shattered, and Elias Crow was standing exactly where he'd been before, except now Wade's revolver was in his hand. Jesus Christ, Cole whispered, his own hand frozen on his weapon. Elias removed the bullets from Wade's gun one at a time, letting them fall into the dirt. Then he tossed the empty revolver back to Wade, who was still gasping for air. Leave, Elias said again. His voice hadn't risen, hadn't hardened. It was simply a statement of fact, like telling them the sun would set in the west. Cole helped his brother to his feet. Wade was red-faced, humiliated, trembling with rage and shock. But something in Elias's eyes stopped him from trying again. something that spoke of depths and dangers neither brother wanted to explore. They mounted up, Wade clutching his ribs, and rode back towards Stillwater. Neither spoke for the first 2 miles. Finally, Cole broke the silence. What the hell just happened? Wade shook his head. His ribs hurt. His back hurt. His pride hurt worst of all. I don't know. I've been in 100 fights, Cole. 100. And I've never... He moved like... I don't know what. We can't tell Jack about this. We have to tell him something. Cole thought for a long moment. We tell him the rancher refused. We tell him he needs more persuasion. We come back with more men. I don't want to go back there. We don't have a choice. Cole's jaw tightened. Jack finds out we got run off by 1 man. We're finished. We need to handle this right. But when they reached Stillwater and reported to Jack Garrett, they found he was less interested in excuses and more interested in examples. That evening, in the saloon's back room, Jack Garrett listened to the Hutchins brothers' carefully edited story. They'd left out the part where Wade got thrown like a sack of grain, left out the part where they'd retreated without firing a shot. They made it sound like Crow was simply stubborn, not dangerous. Jack leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. So we have 1 holdout, 1 rancher who thinks he's special. He's isolated, Cole offered, way out in the Eastern Valley. Doesn't really affect the town business. That's not the point. Jack's voice went cold. The point is, everyone pays or everyone learns what happens when they don't. We let this rancher slide. Next week, someone else thinks they can slide too. Then another. Then we've got nothing. Beside him, a woman named Elizabeth Kane nodded. She was Jack's second in command, 30 years old, with copper hair and a mind like a steel trap. Unlike the crude violence preferred by most of the gang, Elizabeth understood psychology. She knew that fear was a currency more valuable than gold. We need to make an example, she said, but carefully. Can't just ride out there and burn his ranch. That looks desperate, like he's scared us. We need to break him publicly, bring him into town, humiliate him, make sure everyone sees what happens to people who refuse us. Jack smiled. I like that. How? Give him 1 more chance. Send more men this time. Make it clear this isn't a negotiation. If he still refuses, we drag him back here and make him pay in front of the whole town. Strip him, beat him, make him beg. Then maybe we let him crawl home. And if he fights? Elizabeth's smile matched Jack's. Then we kill him, and we do it slow enough that everyone remembers. What? The next morning, 5 riders left Stillwater heading east. The Hutchins brothers, plus 3 more of Garrett's men, experienced killers named Dutch Keller, Tom Morrison, and a half-Cheyenne tracker called Walks Far. They were armed and angry, ready to teach this stubborn rancher a lesson he wouldn't forget. Elias saw them coming long before they reached his property line. 5 riders this time, spread out in a loose formation. They were trying to look intimidating, trying to cover more ground, trying to make him feel surrounded. He felt nothing but a distant professional interest. He'd spent the previous day preparing. The work was familiar, almost meditative, old skills returning like muscle memory. He'd told himself when he came to this valley that he was done with that life, that he could build something different here, that the violence could stay buried. He'd known better, even then. The riders approached more cautiously this time. They'd learned something from Wade's experience, even if they didn't know exactly what. They stopped 50 yards out, just beyond easy pistol range. "Crow," Dutch Keller called out. He was a big man, 40-something, with a voice like grinding stone. "We're giving you 1 more chance. Pay what you owe, or we take you back to Stillwater for a lesson you won't forget." Elias stood on his porch, hands loose at his sides. "I don't owe anything." "Last chance," Tom Morrison shouted. "Come peaceful, or we drag you." Elias didn't move. He could see the way they'd positioned themselves, trying to create crossfire, trying to eliminate his options. It was decent tactics for amateurs. Against a professional, it was suicide. "We're coming in," Dutch announced. "You resist, you die." They advanced slowly, weapons drawn, spreading out to surround the house. Elias waited until they were 20 yards away, then stepped back inside and closed the door. The riders exchanged glances. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People were supposed to panic, to run, to fight, not just close the door. "Smoke him out," Dutch ordered. "Tom, Wade, Get to the barn. Set it on fire. Cole, walks far. With me. We're going in through the front." What happened next would be debated in Stillwater for years afterward. The survivors would tell different versions, each trying to explain something that didn't make sense. But certain facts remained consistent across all accounts. The barn didn't burn. Tom Morrison reached it first, can of kerosene in hand. He never lit the match. The first shot came from somewhere inside the barn. Impossible, since they'd watched Crow go into the house. And Tom went down with a bullet through his shoulder. Wade spun toward the barn, firing blindly, and a second shot punched through his left leg, dropping him screaming to the dirt, Dutch, Cole, and Walks. Farr charged the house. The front door was locked. Dutch kicked it in, and they rushed inside to find nothing. An empty room, a cold stove, a table with breakfast dishes still on it. No Crow. "Back door," Cole shouted. But when they ran to the back of the house, they found that door locked from the outside. Impossible. Crow had gone in the front. They'd watched him. There was no way. The shot came through the window. Dutch's hat flew off his head, the bullet passing so close he felt its heat. All three men dove for cover, crashing behind furniture, and that's when they understood. They weren't fighting a rancher. They were fighting something else entirely. Shots came from multiple positions. The barn, the house, the ridge behind the property. Precise, controlled, never wasted. Each one designed not just to hit, but to herd, to control, to panic. Wade was screaming, clutching his leg. Tom was unconscious from blood loss. The remaining three were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. "He's not alone!" Dutch shouted. "He's got help! He's got—" Another shot, this one clipping Cole's shoulder, making him drop his rifle. "Retreat!" Dutch screamed. "Fall back! Fall back!" But falling back meant exposing themselves to open ground. The moment they moved, shots came from new angles. It was like fighting a ghost, fighting shadows, fighting someone who could be anywhere and everywhere. In the end, it was Walks Farr who saved them. The tracker had noticed something the others missed. The shots, despite coming from different positions, had a pattern, a rhythm. They were being controlled by one person, not many. One person who was moving faster than should be possible, using the terrain and structures to create illusions of multiple shooters. "One man," Walks Farr said quietly. "Just one. He's in the barn now. We go together, fast. We can—" "No!" Dutch grabbed him. "You didn't see what happened to Wade yesterday. I don't know what this man is, but we are not equipped to fight him. Get Tom. Get Wade. We're leaving. Jack wasn't here. Jack didn't see this. We tell him what happened. We regroup. We come back with everyone. But right now, we leave." They dragged their wounded back to their horses, expecting bullets in their backs at any moment. But no more shots came. When they were mounted and riding hard for Stillwater, Dutch risked one look back. Elias Crow stood on his porch again, exactly where he'd been before, arms loose at his sides, not even breathing hard, watching them run. And Dutch Keller, who'd killed 17 men and feared nothing, felt ice settle in his stomach. Because in that moment, he understood what the Hutchins brothers had felt. What every man who'd ever met real violence eventually learned. There are sheep, there are wolves, and then there are things that hunt wolves. Elias Crow was the third kind. But news of the failed raid spread through Stillwater like wildfire. The stories grew with each telling. Some said Crow had a dozen men hidden in his barn. Others claimed he was a vengeful spirit who couldn't be killed. The truth, filtered through the haze of fear and whiskey, became legend. In the saloon's back room, Jack Garrett listened to Dutch Keller's report with growing fury. "One man," he said flatly. "You're telling me one man ran off 5 armed riders. It wasn't normal," Dutch insisted. His hands were shaking, not from fear of Jack, but from the memory of those methodical shots. "The way he moved, the way he shot, Jack, I've been in range wars. I've fought Comanche warriors. This was different." Elizabeth Kane stood by the window, her sharp mind working through the implications. "Who is he, really?" "Just a rancher, far as anyone knows," Dutch said. "Showed up 8 months ago, bought the land cheap, kept to himself." "No," Elizabeth shook her head. "Men with skills like that don't just appear from nowhere. He's got a history. Military, lawman, professional gunfighter." "Does it matter?" Jack slammed his fist on the table. He's one man, one. We've got 20 riders if we call everyone in. We overwhelm him, burn him out, end this. Or, Elizabeth said carefully, we acknowledge that this fight costs more than it's worth. He's isolated. He's not affecting our operation in town. We leave him alone. Jack's eyes went dangerous. Leave him alone? So every other farmer and shopkeeper knows we back down from one stubborn rancher? So they all think they can refuse us? They won't think that if we control the narrative. Elizabeth moved to the table, her voice smooth and calculating. We say Crow's crazy. We say he's dangerous, that he murdered 2 of our men unprovoked. We make him the villain, not us. Then we focus on what matters, squeezing the town for everything it's got. Jack considered this. His pride screamed for blood, for revenge, for Crow's head on a pike. But Elizabeth's logic was sound. The town was already paying. The money was flowing. Going to war with a ghost in the Eastern Valley would cost time, men, and resources they didn't need to spend. But before he could answer, one of his men burst into the room. Jack, riders coming in from the north. At least 8 of them, maybe more. They're not friendly. Jack and Elizabeth exchanged glances. Who? Don't know, but they're armed for war. The McCarty gang had heard about Stillwater's new management. Carson McCarty, their leader, saw opportunity where others saw trouble. The Garrett gang was spread thin, trying to control a territory they barely held. If McCarty could take out Jack, he could absorb Garrett's operation and double his own take. It was simple frontier mathematics. Eliminate the competition. They rode in hard and fast, 8 men who'd cut their teeth on violence and greed. They found Jack Garrett and his remaining men in the street, and for a moment, the whole town held its breath. Heard you had some trouble, Carson called out. He was older than Jack, 50-something, with gray in his beard and scars on his hands. Heard one rancher's been giving you problems. Jack's hand stayed near his gun. Heard wrong. We've got everything under control. That's not what I hear. I hear you're weak. I hear you can't even handle one stubborn farmer. Carson smiled. Maybe this town needs new management. The tension stretched like a wire pulled tight. Both gangs were armed, both were ready, and both knew that when the shooting started, a lot of people would die. Then, into that electric silence, a new voice spoke. You're both leaving. Every head turned. Elias Crow sat on his horse at the end of the street, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. He'd ridden into Stillwater for the first time in a month, and his timing couldn't have been more dramatic, or more deliberate. Jack Garrett stared in disbelief. You've got balls coming here, Crow. You've been causing problems, Elias said calmly. Both of you. The good people of this town didn't ask for your protection. They don't want it. You're parasites, and this valley is done with you. Carson McCarty laughed. You hear this? 1 man against 16 guns, and he thinks he's in charge. Elias dismounted slowly. His hand stayed visible, away from his weapon. But there was something in his bearing, in the quiet confidence of his movements, that made several men unconsciously step back. I'm giving you the same offer I gave his men, Elias said. Right away. Forget this place. Live to find easier prey somewhere else. And if we refuse? Jack asked. Elias's pale eyes swept across them all. 16 armed men, experienced killers, the kind of force that could reduce a town to ashes. Then I'll kill you all, he said simply. Not all at once. Not in some grand showdown. I'll hunt you, one by one, in the dark, in the silence. You'll never see me coming. You'll just die. The street went absolutely quiet, because in that moment everyone present, the gang members, the townspeople, even the children watching from windows, recognized something in Elias Crow's voice. This wasn't a bluff. This wasn't bravado. This was a man stating fact with the same certainty he might say the sky was blue. He would do exactly what he promised, and he had the skills to make it happen. Carson McCarty felt something he hadn't felt in 30 years. Genuine fear, not panic, not the adrenaline of a fight, but the deep primal recognition that he was in the presence of an apex predator. Who the hell are you? He whispered. Elias didn't answer. He simply stood there, waiting. The sun was setting behind him, casting his shadow long across the dirt street, and in that shadow, both gangs saw their own deaths waiting. Elizabeth Kane, watching from the saloon window, understood something the men didn't. This wasn't about bravery or firepower. This was about certainty. Crow knew exactly what he was, exactly what he could do. That knowledge gave him power that no gun could match. "Jack," she said quietly, appearing in the doorway. "Let's hear him out." "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious." She looked at Elias, then back to Jack. "We're business people. This town's not worth dying over. There are 100 other towns, 1,000 other opportunities. We take what we've made and we move on. Pride's expensive. Sometimes it's fatal." Jack's jaw worked. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to prove dominance, to crush this uppity rancher who dared challenge him. But Elizabeth was right. The math didn't work. Even if they killed Crow, and that was no longer looking like a certainty, the cost would be too high. "1 week," Jack said finally. "We give the town 1 week to pull together what they owe us for our time here, fair compensation for the protection we've provided. Then we leave."
"No," Elias said flatly. "You leave now. You take what you can carry on your horses and you ride. The town owes you nothing."
"That's not—" Elias's hand moved just slightly. Not toward his gun. Just a shift in posture, a readiness that everyone recognized. Jack Garrett had been in 100 standoffs. He knew when he was looking at death. And right now, death wore a rancher's clothes and spoke in quiet Montana vowels. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "We'll leave." But Carson McCarty, had already made his decision. He'd come to Stillwater looking for easy pickings, not a war with whatever Elias Crow was. "We're done here," Carson said, turning his horse. "This town's cursed anyway. Can keep it." Both gangs rode out within the hour, taking only what they could carry. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as the men who'd terrorized them for weeks simply left, because one quiet man had said so. When the last rider disappeared over the horizon, Martha Henderson walked up to Elias, who was checking his horse's saddle. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know how you did that, but thank you." Elias nodded once, not meeting her eyes. "They'll tell others. Your town might see more trouble before this is done. Then we'll deal with it, together, and," she paused, "we'd be honored if you'd help us. If you'd be part of this community." For a moment, something flickered in Elias's pale eyes, something that might have been longing or regret, or both. "I'm not good at community," he said quietly. "I'm better at solitude." "Nobody's good at everything, but you're good at protecting people. That counts for something." Elias swung into his saddle. "They'll come back. Not Garrett, not McCarty, but others. Word spreads about unprotected towns." "Then I guess it's good you're nearby." He looked down at her, and for the first time since arriving in Stillwater, something like a smile touched his face. It didn't last long, and it didn't reach his eyes, but it was there. "I'll watch," he said, "from my valley, and if trouble comes, I'll hear about it." He rode east, back to his ranch, back to his silence and solitude. The townspeople watched him go, understanding that they'd been saved by a man they'd probably never truly know, but saved they were, at least for now. That night, in his ranch house, Elias sat at his table and allowed himself to remember. The memories he'd tried to bury, the skills he'd tried to forget, the life he'd walked away from. He'd been a different person then. Different name, different face, different soul. He'd worked for people who paid well for problems to disappear. He'd been the best at what he did, and what he did wasn't beautiful. When he'd finally walked away, after too many deaths, too many ghosts following him through the night, he'd thought distance and silence might bring peace. They hadn't. Because men like him didn't find peace. They found purpose, or they found nothing. And today, facing down those gangs, he'd felt it again. The clarity that came with knowing exactly what needed to be done and having the skills to do it. He'd chosen this valley because it was isolated, because it was forgotten, because no trouble should ever find it. But he'd also chosen it because deep down, he'd known trouble would come eventually. It always did. And when it came, he'd be ready. Not because he wanted to fight, but because some men were built for it, whether they wanted to be or not. Outside, the Montana night settled over the valley like a blanket. Stars emerged in the clear sky, cold and distant and uncaring. Somewhere out there, word was spreading. About Stillwater, about the town that fought back, about the quiet rancher who'd sent two gangs running with nothing but words and will. And in saloons and camps across the frontier, dangerous men were hearing that story and making calculations. Some would decide Stillwater wasn't worth the risk. Others would see it as a challenge, a chance to prove themselves against the legend. Elias knew this, expected it, was already preparing for it, because the truth Martha Henderson didn't understand, the truth nobody in Stillwater understood, was that Elias hadn't come to their valley by accident. He'd come hunting, not for any specific person or gang, but for a purpose, for a reason to use skills that were rotting inside him, growing toxic from disuse. The gangs had given him that reason. And now that they'd started this dance, it would continue until one side or the other was destroyed completely. Elias stood and walked to his window, looking out at the dark valley. "Come," he said quietly to the night, to the predators it sheltered, to the violence that was surely coming. "I'm ready." The valley didn't answer, but somewhere in the darkness something heard him and smiled. The first whisper reached Stillwater 3 weeks after the gangs left. A drifter passing through mentioned he'd heard talk in a camp 50 miles north. Talk about a rancher who'd faced down 16 guns and won without firing a shot. The story had changed in the telling, as stories always did. Some versions claimed Elias had used dark magic. Others said he was a former Union sharpshooter gone mad. One particularly creative variant insisted he could kill a man just by looking at him hard enough. George Henderson listened to these tales with growing unease. He sat in his general store, tallying inventory, while Martha fretted beside him. "People are talking," she said, arranging canned goods on a shelf with unnecessary vigor. "Not just here, everywhere. That drifter said he heard the story in 3 different towns." "Let them talk," George replied, not looking up from his ledger. "You don't understand. When stories spread like this, they attract attention. The wrong kind of attention." She was right, though neither of them knew just how right. 200 miles southeast, in a nameless town that existed primarily to service the railroad, a man named Victor Crane heard the story and felt his interest sharpen like a blade being honed. Crane was not a gang leader in the traditional sense. He didn't rob banks or terrorize towns. He was something more refined, more dangerous, a problem solver for wealthy men who had obstacles they needed removed with discretion and permanence. His fee was substantial. His success rate was perfect. He sat in a private room above a gambling hall, listening to his informant, a nervous little man who made his living collecting and selling information across the frontier. "This Crow fellow," the informant said, wiping sweat from his bald head despite the room's chill. "The stories might be exaggerated, but something happened in Stillwater. Jack Garrett's gang left without a fight. So did the McCarty bunch. That's verified." "One man," Crane said. His voice was cultured, educated, completely at odds with the violence he represented. "Convinced 2 gangs to abandon a lucrative operation. Either he's extraordinarily lucky or he's extraordinarily skilled. Does it matter which?" Crane smiled. He was 45, lean as a whip, with silver threading his dark hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they observed. "It matters tremendously. Luck runs out. Skill, properly understood and countered, can be neutralized." "You thinking of going to Stillwater?" "I'm thinking that a man who can do what this Crow apparently did represents either a significant threat or a significant opportunity. Perhaps both." Crane stood, adjusting his immaculate suit coat. "And I've never been one to leave interesting questions unanswered." But Crane wasn't the only one taking notice. In a mining camp in the Wyoming Territory, a woman named Clara Vasquez heard the story and recognized something the others missed. She'd been tracking patterns of violence across the frontier for 2 years, following the trail of a man she'd once known. A man who'd disappeared after completing one final, impossibly dangerous assignment. A man who'd been the best killer she'd ever seen. Clara was 32, with black hair shot through with premature gray and scars on her hands from a dozen close calls. She'd worked alongside the man she was tracking, back when they'd both been young and stupid, and convinced their skills made them invincible. They'd parted ways after a job went catastrophically wrong, after she'd taken a bullet meant for him, and he'd vanished into the night carrying her blood on his hands. She'd spent 5 years wanting him dead, then another 5 years wanting answers. Now, hearing about a quiet rancher in Montana who could make gangs disappear, she felt the old certainty settle in her gut. She'd found him. "Elias Crow," she said to herself, testing the name. It wasn't the one she'd known him by, but names were cheap on the frontier.
What the hell are you doing in Montana?
She packed her gear and headed north, not certain whether she was going to kill him or save him or something in between. Meanwhile, in Stillwater itself, the aftermath of the gang's departure was creating its own complications. The town had tasted freedom, had seen what was possible when someone stood up to predators. But that taste came with a price. People wanted more. "We should form a militia," Thomas Wright declared at a town meeting held in the church. He was a rancher, 50-something, with sun-damaged skin and a voice accustomed to shouting over wind and livestock. "We've got 15 men of fighting age. We arm ourselves, we train, we make sure no gang ever pushes us around again." "With what weapons?" someone called from the back. "Half of us don't own guns, and those who do can barely shoot straight." "Then we learn, we practice. We get ourselves killed," Martha Henderson interrupted. She stood near the front, her arms crossed, her expression firm. "Tom, I appreciate the sentiment, but we're shopkeepers and farmers, not soldiers. What happened with the gangs, that was Crow's doing, not ours." "Exactly my point. We can't rely on one man to save us every time trouble comes. We need to defend ourselves." "Or," George Henderson suggested quietly, "we could ask Crow to help us. Not to fight for us, but to teach us, if he's willing." The room went silent. The idea had a certain logic to it, but it also felt presumptuous. Elias had made it clear he preferred solitude. Asking him to involve himself further in town affairs seemed like overstepping. "I'll ask him," Martha said finally. "Next time he comes for supplies. Worst he can say is no." But Elias didn't come to town the following month, or the month after that. By the time autumn arrived, painting the valley in shades of gold and rust, people were beginning to wonder if he'd left entirely. He hadn't. Elias had simply recognized what was coming and was preparing for it. The stories spreading across the frontier weren't just talk. They were advertisements, challenges, invitations. He'd painted a target on himself in the town, and sooner or later, someone would come to test the legend. He spent his days fortifying his ranch in ways that wouldn't be visible to casual observation. He dug shallow trenches in strategic locations, covered them with brush that looked natural, but could be crossed only by someone who knew the safe paths. He cached weapons and ammunition in weatherproof containers buried at precise intervals around his property. He memorized sightlines, calculated firing angles, created fallback positions. It was work he'd done before, in other places, for other reasons. The skills came back easily, like a language once spoken fluently and never quite forgotten. On a cold October morning, he was checking one of his hidden supply caches when he heard the sound of a horse approaching. Not multiple horses, not the heavy drum of a gang on the move, just one rider, moving at an easy pace. Elias emerged from the tree line, his rifle held low and ready, and watched the rider crest the ridge. When he saw who it was, something cold settled in his chest. Clara Vasquez sat her horse like she'd been born in the saddle, which she nearly had. She saw Elias and reined in, making no move toward the weapons visible on her saddle. "Hello, James," she said. The name struck him like a physical blow. He hadn't heard it in 8 years. Hadn't thought of himself as James Carver since the day he'd buried that identity, along with too many bodies to count. "That's not my name anymore," he said quietly. "Names are just words. They don't change who we are." She swung down from her horse, moving carefully, keeping her hands visible. "You look older. Harder." "So do you." "Yeah, well, getting shot tends to age a person." She touched her left side unconsciously, where the scar from that long-ago bullet still ached when it rained. "You disappeared after the Cortez job, after I took that bullet. I woke up in a field hospital and you were gone. I got you to safety. That was all I could do. You could have stayed. You could have explained. You could have done anything except vanish like smoke." Elias lowered his rifle slightly but didn't relax. "Why are you here, Clara?" "Because I heard stories about a quiet rancher in Montana who made 2 gangs run away just by looking at them. And I thought, I know someone who could do that. Someone who was good enough, dangerous enough, broken enough." She took a step closer, so I came to see if it was true. If you were really alive, really here, really trying to be someone else. "I am someone else. Are you?" Her voice sharpened. "Because from what I hear, you're still doing the same thing you always did, killing bad people, protecting good ones. You just changed the scenery." It's different. How? Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked past her, at the valley stretching away toward the mountains, at the land he'd chosen because it was supposed to be an ending, not a beginning. Before, I worked for whoever paid, he said finally. I didn't ask questions, didn't care about right or wrong. The work was the thing, the precision, the skill, the completion. That was enough. And now? Now it matters. The people here, they're not employers. They're not targets. They're just people, trying to live, trying to survive. And when predators come for them, I can either help or I can let it happen. That choice means something. Clara studied him for a long moment. You think you're being noble. You think this is redemption. I think I'm being useful. You're being a target. She moved closer, her voice urgent now. James, Elias, whoever you are, the stories are spreading. I'm not the only one who heard them. There are people out there who'll come looking for you. Not because they want to hurt this town, because they want to test themselves against the legend. You're a challenge now. A prize. I know. And you're just going to wait for them? Pick them off one by one until someone gets lucky and puts you down? If necessary. That's suicide. Maybe. Elias met her eyes. Or maybe it's the only thing I was ever good at. Maybe this is where I'm supposed to make my stand. Clara shook her head slowly. You always were a dramatic bastard. Fine. You want to die for these people? At least let me help you not die stupidly. I don't need help. Yes, you do. You're good, James. Maybe the best I ever saw, but you're one person. And what's coming? She paused, choosing her words carefully. I heard something else while I was tracking you. There's a man named Victor Crane asking questions about Stillwater. You know who he is? Elias's expression went very still. I know him. He worked the Cortez job. He was the one who set up the crossfire that nearly killed me. He's methodical, patient, and he never stops until a job is done. The job was 8 years ago. For you and me, maybe. But Crane specializes in long-term problems. If he's interested in Stillwater, it's because someone paid him to be interested. And whoever that someone is, they've got resources. Elias absorbed this information. He'd known Crane by reputation during his previous life, a professional's professional, the kind of man who turned killing into an art form. If Crane was involved, this wasn't about gangs or territory. This was about something bigger. Who would pay Crane to come after a forgotten town in Montana? He asked. That's what we need to find out. Clara glanced toward Stillwater, invisible beyond the western ridge. But first, you need to tell me everything. The gangs, the confrontation, who might have connections to money and power. Because Crane doesn't work for petty criminals. He works for rich men with problems they can't solve legally. They walked back to Elias's ranch, and for the first time in 8 years, James Carver, now Elias Crow, told someone the truth about who he'd been and what he'd done. Clara listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. By the time he finished, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. So you came here to die quietly, Clara said, and instead you've started a war. I didn't start anything. I just finished what others began. Semantics. She poured herself coffee from the pot on his stove, settling into a chair like she belonged there. Here's what's going to happen. Crane will come, probably with a team. He'll study you, learn your patterns, identify your weaknesses. Then he'll strike when and where you're most vulnerable. That's how he works. I know. So we need to be smarter. We need to control the battlefield, control the timing, control the narrative. Clara leaned forward. And we need allies. Because I don't care how good you are, you can't watch every angle, can't be everywhere at once. The townspeople aren't fighters. Then we make them fighters. Or at least we make them obstacles. Eyes and ears, early warning, disruption. Crani's used to operating in the shadows. We fill those shadows with people who'll notice him. Elias considered this. Everything in him resisted the idea of involving civilians, of putting untrained people in harm's way. But Clara was right. Alone, he was vulnerable. With help, even untrained help, he could create advantages. I'll talk to them, he said. We'll talk to them. Together. Tomorrow. That night, Clara slept in the barn. Her choice, claiming she'd gotten used to harder beds and open air. Elias lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling, and allowed himself to feel something he'd thought long dead. Hope. Not for himself. He'd made peace with whatever ending was coming, but for Stillwater, for the people who'd shown him that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than violence and solitude. If Clara was here, if she was willing to help, maybe they had a chance. Dawn came cold and clear. They rode into Stillwater together, and the sight of Elias accompanied by a stranger caused immediate speculation. By the time they tied their horses outside the general store, half the town had found reasons to be nearby. Martha Henderson emerged from her shop, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes went from Elias to Clara and back again. "Mr. Crow, it's been a while." "Mrs. Henderson, I need to speak with the town, all of you. It's important." The church. The church. Within an hour, every adult in Stillwater had crowded into the small wooden building. Elias stood at the front, uncomfortable with the attention, while Clara leaned against the wall near the door, watching the crowd with professional assessment. "You all know what happened here months ago," Elias began. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "Two gangs left because I convinced them it wasn't worth their time. But my presence here has created a new problem. My actions attracted attention. Stories spread. And now, people are coming who want to test themselves against those stories." Nervous murmurs rippled through the crowd. "What kind of people?" Thomas Wright asked. "Professional killers, men and women who make their living removing obstacles for wealthy employers. They're not bandits or outlaws. They're soldiers in everything but name, and they're very good at what they do." "When?" Martha's voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Soon. Maybe days, maybe weeks, but they're coming." "Then we fight," Thomas declared, standing. "Like I said before, we form a militia. We defend our town." "You'll die," Clara said flatly. Everyone turned to look at her. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But bravery without skill is just suicide with better intentions. The people coming aren't the gangs you scared off. They're professionals. They'll kill you before you know they're there." "Then what do we do?" Someone called from the back. Elias took a breath. "You help me, not by fighting, by watching, by listening, by being my eyes and ears. These people will come quietly, carefully. They'll scout the town, learn the patterns, find the weaknesses. If you can notice them, report them, give me advance warning, that's worth more than a dozen untrained guns." "You want us to spy?" George asked. "I want you to survive, and the best way to do that is to make sure I know what's coming before it arrives." Silence settled over the church. People exchanged glances, weighing fear against determination, self-preservation against community responsibility. Finally, Martha spoke. "What do you need us to do?" Relief flickered across Elias's face, gone almost before it registered. "Notice strangers. Anyone who doesn't fit, who asks too many questions, who seems too interested in routines and schedules. Don't confront them, just report them. To me, to Mrs. Henderson, to anyone you trust. We create a network of information." "That's it?" Thomas sounded disappointed. "We just watch?" "Watching keeps you alive," Clara said. "Fighting gets you killed. Trust me on this." Over the next 2 weeks, Stillwater transformed itself in subtle ways. People paid attention to strangers in ways they never had before. Shopkeepers noted unfamiliar faces. Ranchers reported unknown riders. Children were taught to observe and remember, and gradually, a picture began to form. 3 strangers had arrived in town over 10 days, each claiming different purposes. One said he was a surveyor, mapping potential railroad routes. Another claimed to be a traveling merchant. The third was a woman who said she was visiting family, though nobody could identify which family that might be. Clara investigated each one personally, using skills honed over years of similar work. The surveyor was legitimate, boring, methodical, and genuinely interested in rail lines. But the merchant and the woman were different. They asked too many questions, watched too carefully. Their stories had holes that widened under scrutiny. "Scouts," Clara told Elias. "Crane's people, or someone similar. They're mapping the town, identifying defenses, learning who matters." Then Crane himself? Not yet. He'll wait for the full report. Then he'll come with a plan already formed. She paused. We should remove the scouts. Send a message. No. Elias shook his head. If they disappear, Crane knows we're on to him. Better to let them report. Let him think he has complete intelligence. Then we use that against him. Risky. Everything about this is risky. Clara smiled grimly. Fair point. But neither of them anticipated what happened next. The merchant, a man calling himself David Ross, made a mistake. He got drunk in the saloon one night and started asking pointed questions about Elias Crow's daily routine, his habits, his weaknesses. Thomas Wright, who'd been drinking at the same bar, took offense. He wasn't trained, wasn't subtle, but he was loyal and he was angry. When Ross made a disparaging comment about cowards who hide behind one man's protection, Thomas threw a punch. The fight was brief and ugly. Ross, despite his inebriation, moved with professional precision. He broke Thomas's nose, cracked 2 of his ribs, and would have done worse if the bartender hadn't intervened with a shotgun. Ross left the saloon, stumbling slightly, and disappeared into the night. By morning, he was gone from Stillwater entirely. So was the woman claiming to visit family. Only the legitimate surveyor remained, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. They know we're watching, Clara said. Ross getting into a fight spooked them. They've pulled back to report. Elias stood on the ridge above his ranch, looking west toward town. How long until Crane comes? Days, maybe a week. He'll want to move while we're still on edge, still reactive. That's when mistakes happen. Then we prepare, now, everything we've got. They worked through the next 72 hours with ruthless efficiency. Elias showed Clara the hidden caches, the prepared positions, the sight lines he'd calculated. She approved some, modified others, and added her own touches, false trails, dead ends, traps disguised as safe routes. You think like a sniper, she observed. Everything's about distance and precision, but Crane thinks like a chess player. He'll try to force you into moves, create situations where every choice is bad. So we make his choices bad instead. Exactly. On the 4th day, a rider arrived in Stillwater. He was young, maybe 20, with nervous eyes and a letter he claimed he'd been paid to deliver to Elias Crow. Martha Henderson accepted it, noting the boy's description, and immediately sent word to the ranch. Elias opened the letter that evening, Clara reading over his shoulder. The handwriting was immaculate, the message brief. Mr. Crow, I understand you've become something of a local legend. I appreciate effective work, having built a career on similar principles. However, your recent activities have inconvenienced a client of mine, a client willing to pay substantially for resolution of this inconvenience. I propose a meeting, neutral ground, both parties unarmed, simply to discuss terms. You may find my employer's offer generous enough to render further conflict unnecessary. If interested, be at the old mining camp north of Stillwater at noon, 3 days hence. Come alone, or don't come at all. Professionally yours, V. Crane. Clara read it twice, then looked at Elias. It's a trap, obviously. You're not actually considering, I'm considering everything. Elias set the letter down. Who's his client? Who paid Crane to come after me or the town? That information might be worth the risk. Information you'll never get, because Crane will kill you the moment you show up. Maybe. Or maybe he really does want to negotiate. Killing me in an ambush has complications. Witnesses, evidence, potential retaliation. But if we meet, talk, and I refuse his terms, then he's justified whatever comes next in his own mind. Clara stared at him. You're thinking like prey. You're trying to understand the predator's logic. That's backwards. Is it? Or is it the only way to stay ahead? They argued for an hour, neither willing to concede. Finally, Clara threw up her hands in frustration. Fine. You want to walk into an obvious trap, that's your funeral. Literally. But I'm coming with you. Agreement be damned. He said alone. And I said I'm coming. You want to stop me, you'll have to shoot me. And I notice you haven't even reached for your gun. Elias almost smiled. You're still as stubborn as ever. Pot. Meat kettle. They spent the next 3 days preparing for multiple scenarios. If Crane wanted a meeting, they'd give him one, but on their terms, with contingencies stacked on contingencies. The old mining camp was 2 hours north of Stillwater, a collection of rotting structures from a silver rush that had gone bust 15 years ago. It sat in a narrow canyon, overlooked by ridges on 3 sides. Perfect for an ambush. Elias and Clara arrived an hour early, approaching from different directions. She took position on the eastern ridge with a rifle, while he scouted the camp itself. The structures were empty, but someone had been there recently. Fresh boot prints, disturbed dust, the faint smell of tobacco. At 5 minutes before noon, Victor Crane rode into the camp from the south. He came alone, as promised, his hands visible and empty. He was exactly as Elias remembered, lean, elegant, with the bearing of a man utterly confident in his abilities. Crane dismounted, tied his horse, and looked directly at the largest building where Elias waited. "Mr. Crow," he called out, "shall we talk like civilized men?" Elias emerged, his own hands empty, though Clara's presence on the ridge was a secret comfort. "You wanted a meeting. Here I am." "So you are." Crane studied him with open interest. "You know, I've followed your career with some admiration. The Cortez job particularly. Brilliant work. I should have known James Carver wouldn't stay buried forever." "That man is dead." "Is he?" "Because from where I stand, he looks remarkably alive, simply wearing different clothes and answering to a different name." "What does your client want?" Crane smiled. "Direct. I appreciate that. My client wants Stillwater. Specifically, he wants the land it sits on. There are mineral deposits in this valley, rare earths, valuable metals. A geological survey confirmed it 6 months ago. The town is sitting on a fortune and doesn't know it. So buy the land." "Attempted. Residents refused to sell. Some nonsense about community and heritage." Crane's voice dripped contempt. "My client doesn't have time for sentiment. He wants the land cleared, the town gone, and the resources extracted. Originally, he hired the Garrett gang to do it, make life difficult enough that people would leave voluntarily. That failed. Because of you. Which brings us to now. My client is willing to pay you $100,000 to simply leave, disappear. Let nature take its course." Elias felt ice in his veins. "And the people of Stillwater? Will relocate, one way or another. But that's not your concern, is it? You're a professional. You understand that sometimes people get caught in the machinery of progress. It's regrettable, but inevitable. You came all this way to offer me money? I came all this way to offer you a choice. Take the money and live. Refuse it and die. Professional to professional, I'm hoping you choose wisely." Elias looked at Crane, at this mirror image of what he himself had once been. A man who reduced people to obstacles, who saw morality as a luxury professionals couldn't afford. "I refuse," Elias said quietly. Crane sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that. You've gone soft, Carver. Developed a conscience. It's a fatal condition in our line of work." "Maybe, but at least I'll die knowing I chose a side that mattered." "Nobility." Crane shook his head. "How tedious." "Very well. We do this the hard way." He stepped back toward his horse, and Elias tensed, expecting the ambush to spring. But Crane simply mounted, tipped his hat, and rode away. Clara descended from her position, confused. "That's it? He just leaves?" "He got what he wanted. Confirmation that I won't be bought. Now he knows the parameters of the fight." "What fight? He could have killed you right there." "And violated his own terms?" "Crane has rules. They're twisted, inhuman rules, but he follows them. He said if I refused, I'd die. But he didn't say when or how. That comes next." They rode back to Stillwater in silence, both understanding that the real war was just beginning. That night, Elias gathered the town's core leadership in Martha Henderson's living room. 10 people crowded into the small space. The Hendersons, Thomas Wright with his still-healing ribs, the blacksmith Tom Miller, Sarah Chen from the restaurant, and 5 others who'd proven themselves trustworthy observers during the scouting phase. Clara stood by the window, watching the street, while Elias laid out the situation with brutal honesty. "Crane's employer wants this land, not for farming or ranching. There are mineral deposits here, valuable ones, enough to make men kill for them." He paused, letting that sink in. "The gang attacks weren't random. They were hired to drive you out. When I interfered, Crane was brought in to remove me as an obstacle." "So we're sitting on a fortune," George said slowly, "and that fortune is going to get us killed." Unless we stop them first, Thomas interjected. We know they're coming now. We can prepare, fortify, fight back. We can try, Clara said from the window. But understand what you're facing. Crane doesn't work alone. He'll bring a team, professionals, not thugs. They'll have military training, coordinated tactics, superior weapons. Your town has one street, wooden buildings, no defensive positions worth mentioning. In a straight fight, you lose. Then what do we do? Sarah asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. Run? Abandon everything we've built? No, Elias said. We turn this valley into a battlefield designed to our specifications. We use the terrain, the distance, the isolation. We make it so expensive to take this land that Crane's employer decides it's not worth the cost. Martha leaned forward. How? By making them think they're winning until it's too late to retreat. By drawing them in deep, then cutting off their escape. By being ghosts everywhere and nowhere. Over the next hour, they worked through the plan. It was audacious, risky, and required precision that none of them except Elias and Clara possessed. But it was also their only real chance. The town would evacuate non-combatants, women, children, elderly, to a hidden canyon 15 miles north that Elias had identified during his months of solitary exploration. A few trusted ranchers would escort them and stay to guard them. That left approximately 30 adults willing to fight, though fight was perhaps too generous a term for what they'd actually do. You're not soldiers, Clara told them flatly. You won't be engaging in direct combat. You'll be setting obstacles, destroying resources, creating confusion. Every bridge gets weakened. Every trail gets blocked. Every water source within 10 miles of town gets fouled. We turn this valley into a maze that only we can navigate. That'll hurt us too, Tom Miller pointed out. Yes, but we know where the clean water is, where the safe paths are. They don't. That's the advantage. And when they reach the town itself? Martha asked. Elias answered this time. The town becomes a trap. Empty buildings rigged to collapse. False positions that look defended but aren't. We want them to commit their forces to taking structures that mean nothing, while we observe from positions they can't see. You're talking about letting them burn Stillwater, George said quietly. I'm talking about making them think they've won, while we dismantle them piece by piece. Buildings can be rebuilt. People can't be brought back from the dead. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding and grief. These people were being asked to sacrifice everything they'd built, everything they owned, on the faith that two killers could outwit and outlast a professional military operation. Thomas stood abruptly. I'm in. My ranch is already gone thanks to the Garrett gang's visit. I've got nothing left to lose except my life, and I'll be damned if I give that up without a fight. One by one, the others agreed. Not because they were brave, though some were. Not because they were foolish, though a few might have been. But because the alternative, running, abandoning their homes, living as refugees, was worse than the risk of dying for something that mattered. The evacuation began the next morning, disguised as normal traffic. Families left in ones and twos heading to various destinations they announced loudly in the general store. In reality, they all converged on the hidden canyon where supplies had been pre-positioned and shelter prepared. Elias watched them go with something twisting in his chest. Children who'd waved at him during his monthly supply runs, women who'd offered him coffee despite his silence, old men who'd simply nodded respect across the street. He told himself he was keeping distance, maintaining professional detachment. But watching them flee because of choices he'd made, he understood that detachment had been an illusion. These people mattered to him. When they died, and some would, he had no illusions about that. Their deaths would weigh on him in ways the hundreds of nameless targets from his previous life never had. Second thoughts? Clara asked, appearing beside him. Always. Good. Men without doubts make stupid mistakes. They think certainty equals correctness. She checked her rifle, a well-maintained Winchester she'd carried for a decade. Crane will come at dawn. That's his pattern. Maximum visibility for his forces, minimum for defenders. He likes symmetry. How many? If he's smart, 20 to 30. Enough to overwhelm resistance, not so many that coordination breaks down. They'll have a main force and flanking elements, probably a sniper team on the high ground. The Western Ridge.
That's where I'd put them.
Clara smiled without humor, which is why we'll make sure that ridge is the last place they want to be. They'd spent 3 days preparing that particular surprise. The western ridge overlooks Stillwater from 1,500 yards, perfect sniper distance. Crane's team would naturally gravitate toward it, seeking the high ground advantage. What they wouldn't know until too late was that Elias had undermined the entire southern face of that ridge. Not enough to cause immediate collapse, but enough that concentrated weight, say, from several men and their equipment, would trigger a landslide. It was the kind of preparation that took time, labor, and knowledge of geology that Elias had acquired during his years of making death look accidental. Clara had helped with calculations, determining exactly how much support to remove without making the instability visible. "It'll kill whoever's up there," she'd said while they worked. "Yes." "You comfortable with that?" Elias had looked at her, his pale eyes unreadable. "They're coming to kill civilians for money. Their deaths serve a purpose. That's more consideration than they're giving the people of Stillwater." Now, as the last evacuees disappeared into the northern hills, that moment of ruthless calculation felt both distant and immediate. The man he'd been, James Carver, would have set that trap without hesitation or regret. The man he was trying to become, Elias Crow, felt the weight of each choice, each death he was planning. "You're thinking too much," Clara said. "That's new for you." Maybe I should have been thinking more all along. Maybe. But right now, thinking needs to lead to action. "Crane's people will be here within 48 hours. We need final preparations complete." The remaining defenders worked through the night and the following day. They collapsed the bridge over Stillwater Creek, the main approach from the south, making it look like weather damage rather than sabotage. They relocated the town's entire supply of ammunition and food to hidden caches outside the main settlement. They rigged 3 buildings with accelerants, ready to be ignited on command to create smoke cover. Most importantly, they created false intelligence. George Henderson left a journal in the general store, positioned where it would be easily found, detailing defensive positions that were actually kill zones. Sarah Chen prepared a map marked with safe houses that were actually abandoned structures rigged to collapse. Every piece of information Crane's team might find was carefully crafted to lead them exactly where Elias and Clara wanted them. "It's elegant," Clara admitted, reviewing their preparations. "Assuming they take the bait." "Crane's smart, but he's also arrogant. He thinks he's the predator. That makes him vulnerable to exactly this kind of misdirection. And if he sees through it, then we adapt. We've got contingencies built on contingencies." Elias checked his rifle for the 1000th time. "But he won't see through it. Not until it's too late." The confidence in his voice was part real, part performance. Clara recognized both elements and didn't challenge either. They'd done everything possible with the resources and time available. Now came the waiting. Dawn arrived on the 3rd day with unusual clarity. The Montana sky stretched overhead like hammered steel, cold and bright. Elias and Clara were positioned in separate locations. She in a concealed rifle pit 300 yards north of town. He in the bell tower of the church, which offered complete sightlines across Stillwater's single street. The first sign of Crane's approach came at 6:30, when Thomas Wright, positioned as a forward observer 2 miles south, fired a single rifle shot, the signal they'd agreed upon. Enemy sighted, moving north in force. Elias felt the familiar calm settle over him, the state of heightened awareness he'd learned to access during his previous life. Everything became sharper, clearer. Time seemed to slow slightly, giving him space to think, to calculate, to act. 30 minutes later, Crane's force came into view. Clara had estimated well, 27 men, moving in a professional tactical formation. Main element of 15 along the road, 2 flanking groups of 6 each approaching through the tree lines on either side. They moved with disciplined silence, weapons ready, eyes scanning constantly. Professional soldiers, just as Clara had warned. Crane himself led the main element, riding a black horse and carrying himself with the same elegant confidence Elias remembered from their meeting. Behind him, a man Elias recognized from old wanted posters. Samuel Grim Morrison, a former army sergeant who'd gone private after a massacre in the Indian Wars had made him too brutal even for the frontier military. The flanking elements reached the collapsed bridge first. They stopped, examined it, conferred. One man climbed down to inspect the support structure. Even from 1,500 yards, Elias could see the moment they decided it was natural damage, not sabotage. They signaled the main force and began crossing carefully, using fallen timbers as impromptu walkways. First mistake. Elias and Clara had prepared the crossing to look safe while actually being anything but. The timbers were partially cut through, stable under 1 or 2 men's weight, but designed to fail under concentrated load. The flanking element made it across safely. But when the main force tried to follow, clustering together to cross efficiently, 3 timbers gave way simultaneously. Men plunged into the creek below, only 8 feet deep, not fatal, but enough to drench weapons and scatter equipment. Shouts of surprise and anger echoed across the valley. 2 men climbed out immediately, but a third was trapped beneath a fallen beam, his leg clearly broken. Crane dismounted, face expressionless, and watched as his men pulled their injured comrade from the water. He said something Elias couldn't hear at this distance, but the body language was clear. Leave him. We continue forward. The injured man was left with a canteen and a pistol, propped against a tree. No medical attention, no delay. Pure operational efficiency. Second element of character confirmed. Crane valued the mission above his men. The force reorganized and continued north, now more cautious. They'd had their first setback, minor but irritating. Elias could see them adjusting, becoming more watchful, more suspicious. Good. Wary prey made better mistakes than oblivious prey. They reached Stillwater's outskirts by 9 o'clock. The flanking element split wide, preparing to surround the town, while the main force approached the church, the most prominent structure, the obvious command center. Crane would be thinking that controlling the high ground of the bell tower would give him dominance over the battlefield. He was right, which was why Elias had abandoned the bell tower 15 minutes earlier, leaving behind carefully arranged bedding and personal items to suggest ongoing occupation. The main force stacked up outside the church door, ready for a tactical entry. Crane gestured and 4 men rushed in, weapons raised. Elias watched from his new position, a root cellar 200 yards north, with sight lines through a carefully positioned crack as they cleared the ground floor, then advanced up the stairs toward the bell tower. The explosion wasn't large, just enough to collapse the stairwell and bring down part of the tower's support structure. No casualties this time, but 6 men were now trapped on the upper floor as the building groaned and swayed dangerously. Panic rippled through the force. Men rushed to help their trapped comrades, abandoning their tactical positions, clustering around the damaged church. Exactly the response Elias had anticipated. Clara opened fire from her position, her first shot taking down a man at the edge of the cluster. The second shot hit another in the shoulder. She wasn't trying to kill them all. That would be impossible. She was creating chaos, forcing them to respond to threats from unexpected angles. The force scattered, seeking cover, returning fire toward where they thought Clara was positioned. But she'd already moved, using pre-positioned ropes to slide down the backside of her hill and into a covered trench that led to a completely different firing position. From this new angle, she fired 3 more times, each shot precise and controlled. Not trying for kills, though 1 man went down hard and didn't move, but forcing Crane's people to continually reassess the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Western Ridge sniper team had done exactly what Elias predicted. 4 men had climbed to the high ground, setting up overlapping fields of fire to cover the town. They were professionals, choosing their positions with care, establishing communication with hand signals. They never noticed the instability beneath them. The rock face looked solid, felt solid under their boots. But Elias had removed enough support that when one sniper, a heavy man carrying extra ammunition, moved to adjust his position, his weight triggered the collapse. The landslide started small, just a few rocks shifting. Then a whole section gave way, and 4 men tumbled down the slope in a chaos of screaming stone and breaking bodies. The sound echoed across the valley like thunder. When the dust settled, 3 of the snipers were visible in the rubble, unmoving. The 4th had somehow caught himself on a stunted pine tree 15 feet down, clinging desperately to branches that bent but didn't break. Crane's force was now down to 18 effectives, scattered and demoralized. The wounded were crying out for help. The men trapped in the church tower were trying to climb down using a rope they'd found, but it wasn't long enough. The surviving sniper was screaming for rescue, and through it all, 2 ghosts moved unseen, picking their moments, applying pressure, creating the illusion that they were facing a much larger, much better organized resistance. But Crane was no fool. After the initial chaos, Elias saw him rally his remaining men, pulling them into a tight defensive formation in the center of town. He recognized the truth now. Stillwater was a trap, not a fortress. His enemy wasn't defending positions but controlling space, manipulating perception. Cran gathered his officers, Morrison and 2 others, and had a rapid conversation. Then he split his force. Morrison took 8 men and began a systematic withdrawal south, covering each other in tactical bounds. The remaining men, under Crane's direct command, began clearing buildings methodically, setting fires as they went. If Crane couldn't hold the town, he'd destroy it. Elias watched from his position as flames began to spread. The general store went first, smoke billowing black and thick. Then the saloon, the blacksmith shop, Sarah Chen's restaurant. Building by building, Stillwater started to burn. For a moment, he felt something crack inside him. These structures represented safety, community, home, concepts he'd thought he'd lost the ability to value. Watching them burn hurt in ways he hadn't anticipated. Then Claire's voice carried across the distance, sharp and clear despite the chaos. "Let them burn. It's just wood and nails." She was right. Buildings could be rebuilt. The people were safe. The mission was working. But knowing that intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different things. Crane's demolition team worked efficiently, turning Stillwater into an inferno. But they made one crucial error. They assumed the town's value was in the structures themselves. They didn't realize the real trap wasn't the buildings, but the time it took to burn them. While Crane's men were occupied with destruction, Morrison's withdrawal team ran straight into the secondary defensive line Elias and Clara had prepared. The approaches south were mined with tripwires connected to bells. Not dangerous, but loud enough to pinpoint exact positions. As Morrison's men tripped the first wire, bells clanged across the valley. Clara, who'd relocated again, opened fire from a position that put her behind Morrison's line. The angle was impossible. They'd just come from that direction. It should have been clear. But Clara had anticipated their retreat route and positioned herself in a depression they'd bypassed on their advance north. Her shots were careful, controlled. She wasn't trying to kill, though 2 men fell and didn't rise, but to panic. Men who thought they were retreating to safety suddenly found themselves taking fire from their own rear. Morrison did the smart thing. He ordered his men to drop equipment and run. Speed over caution. But in their panic, 3 men ran straight into the fouled water source Elias had prepared. A small pond that looked clear but had been treated with enough mineral salts to cause violent illness within minutes of drinking. The remaining 5 made it to the collapsed bridge, only to find the injured man they'd left behind was gone. Not dead. Gone. His pistol lay on the ground, unused. His canteen was empty. But there was no body, no blood, no sign of struggle, just absence. That psychological element, the disappearing casualty, was pure Clara. She'd circled back during the chaos, approached the injured man, offered him a choice. Stay here and die when they retreat, or let me move you somewhere safe and live. The man, leg shattered, abandoned by his own commander, had chosen life. Clara had carried him to a hidden position and left him with water, bandages, and a message. Tell your friends this valley takes care of its own, even the ones they throw away. Morrison's men found that message carved into a tree trunk near where their comrade had been. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These weren't just fighters defending a town. These were people who valued life enough to rescue an enemy soldier their own commander had abandoned. It planted a seed of doubt that no tactical victory could eradicate. Meanwhile, in Stillwater, Crane had finished his demolition work. The town was burning, smoke rising in columns that could be seen for miles. He gathered his remaining 9 men, nearly 2/3 casualties in less than 4 hours, and began an organized withdrawal. But Elias wasn't done. From his position, he fired a single shot that struck the ground 2 feet in front of Crane's horse. The animal reared and Crane controlled it with expert horsemanship, but his eyes scanned the landscape, searching for the shooter. Elias fired again, this time from a different position. Impossible, since he hadn't had time to move that far. But he'd prepared multiple firing points connected by hidden trenches, allowing him to create the illusion of multiple shooters. Crane's men were rattled now. Their commander wasn't invincible. The ghost or ghosts hunting them could be anywhere. "Hold," Crane commanded. His voice carried across the burning town, calm despite everything. "We regroup at the bridge. Maintain formation. Watch our flanks." Professional to the end. Elias almost admired it. But Clara had one more surprise waiting. The bridge itself, already damaged from the initial crossing, had been further undermined during the fighting. Not enough to collapse under its own weight, but enough that concentrated traffic would finish the job. Morrison's team had crossed carefully, spreading their weight. But Crane's group, already spooked and exhausted, clustered together for mutual protection as they approached the water. The bridge gave way completely this time, dumping 8 men into the creek. Weapons were lost in the current. 2 men struck their heads on rocks and went under. Crane himself was thrown clear, landing on the far bank, but his rifle was gone and his pistol was waterlogged. From the tree line, Clara called out, her voice carrying clearly, "You're done, Crane. Take your survivors and go. Tell your employer this land isn't for sale." Crane climbed to his feet, water streaming from his expensive coat, his cultivated elegance completely destroyed. He stared across the creek at the burning town, at his scattered force, at the unseen enemies who dismantled his operation with surgical precision. Then he did something Elias didn't expect. He laughed. It was genuine laughter, edged with exhaustion and perhaps a touch of madness. "Brilliantly done," he called out to the trees. "Whoever you are, whatever you are, that was masterfully executed." Elias emerged from cover, rifle leveled but not aimed. Across 50 yards of water and smoke, the 2 professionals regarded each other. "Your employer's offer is rejected," Elias said. "This land belongs to the people who built lives here, not to men who see only profit." "You realize this doesn't end here," Crane replied. "My employer has resources, patience, determination. He'll send others. More brutal, less civilized than me. Then they'll meet the same fate. Will they?" Crane's smile was cold. "Or will you eventually fall, Carver? Because that's the thing about men like us. We can win 100 times, but we only have to lose once." "True, but I'm not alone anymore, and that makes all the difference." Crane glanced at his surviving men, 12 out of 27, most injured, all demoralized, and made his calculation. "A temporary withdrawal, not a defeat. I'll give you that much professional courtesy. Call it whatever helps you sleep." Crane mounted his horse, gathering his scattered force. As they limped south, leaving their dead behind, Elias watched until they disappeared from view. Clara emerged from her position, joining him on the creek bank. Together they stood in silence, watching still water burn. "We won," she said quietly. "We survived," Elias corrected. "That's not the same thing." "Close enough for today." The fires burned through the afternoon and into the evening. By nightfall, Stillwater was little more than charred foundations and smoking rubble. The church tower, already damaged by the explosion, had collapsed completely. The general store was ash. Every structure that had given the town its identity was gone. But as darkness settled over the valley, lights appeared in the northern hills. The evacuees, seeing the smoke clear and the danger past, began returning. Slowly at first, then in growing numbers as word spread that the battle was over. Martha Henderson was among the first. She stood at the edge of town looking at the devastation, and tears streamed down her face. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "We rebuild. Better this time. Stronger. With proper defenses and clear sightlines." She looked at Elias. "And with a real community, not just a collection of buildings." George stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "How many did we lose?" "None of ours," Claire said. "The defenders who stayed are all accounted for. Crane lost 15 dead or critically wounded. 15 men." Thomas Wright shook his head. That's a lot of death." "That's what they chose when they came here for money," Elias said flatly. "They knew the risks. They accepted them." But inside, he counted each one. 15 deaths he'd engineered, planned, executed, 15 more ghosts to join the hundreds already haunting his memory. The fact that these deaths served a purpose, protected innocent lives, didn't make them weightless. Over the following days, the scale of their victory became clear. Crane had withdrawn completely, taking his survivors and disappearing. Morrison had apparently broken from the group somewhere in Wyoming, taking 3 men with him and vanishing into the wilderness. The injured man Clara had rescued, a young soldier named Peter Hayes, chose to stay in Stillwater after his leg healed enough to walk, trading his skills as a carpenter for a new start. "I'm done killing for money," he told anyone who'd listen. These people showed me more mercy than my own commander. That means something. His presence, his testimony, became a powerful tool. Word spread across the frontier, not just about the battle, but about the values behind it. Stillwater hadn't just fought off a professional military force. They'd done it while maintaining their humanity, rescuing enemy wounded, offering chances for redemption. It was a story that resonated in ways pure violence never could. But Elias knew Crane's warning was prophetic. This victory would attract new challenges, new threats, men who wanted to test themselves against the legend. Or worse, men hired by Crane's employer to finish what Crane had started. The war wasn't over. This was just the first battle. Reconstruction began the morning after the fires cooled, but it was different this time. The new Stillwater rose from the ashes with intention behind every nail, every board, every stone foundation. Peter Hayes, the former soldier-turned-carpenter, worked alongside Thomas Wright to design structures that could serve dual purposes, homes that could become defensive positions, a new general store with reinforced walls and clear sight lines, a community hall built of stone instead of timber. "We're building a fortress disguised as a town," Peter explained to anyone who asked. His legs still ached in cold weather, a permanent reminder of the battle, but his hands were steady and his measurements precise. "If trouble comes again, we'll be ready." But Elias knew something the townspeople didn't, something he'd seen in Crane's eyes during their final exchange across the creek. The professional had withdrawn, yes, but not in defeat. Crane had withdrawn to regroup, to report, to plan, and somewhere in a distant city, a wealthy man was receiving news that his investment had failed, that his hired force had been destroyed by backwoods defenders who should have been easy prey. Men with that kind of wealth didn't accept failure. They escalated. 2 months after the battle, as winter began settling over the Montana Valley in earnest, a telegram arrived at the newly rebuilt general store. It was addressed to Martha Henderson, but marked for immediate delivery to Elias Crow. Martha brought it to his ranch herself, riding through early snow with George beside her. Elias read the telegram twice, his expression unchanging. Then he handed it to Clara, who'd stayed in Stillwater despite her initial plan to move on after the fighting ended. The message was brief. Federal Marshal arriving Stillwater. Stop. Investigation of reported massacre. Stop. Testimony required. Stop. Arrive prepared. Stop. Massacre, Clara said flatly. "They're calling what we did a massacre." "Crane's employer has connections," Elias replied. "Money buys influence. Influence shapes narratives. We killed 15 men. On paper, without context, that looks like murder." Martha's face had gone pale. "They can't possibly think we're the criminals here. Those men came to destroy our town, to kill us for land we rightfully own. What we know and what we can prove in a court are different things." George's voice was heavy with understanding. "Crane's people took their dead with them when they withdrew. There's no physical evidence here except our testimony and a burned town." "Which could have been burned by anyone," Clara finished, "including us, to cover up crimes. That's how they'll frame it if they're smart." Elias stood, walking to his window. Outside, snow was beginning to accumulate, turning the valley into a study in white and gray. "When does the marshal arrive?" "Telegram didn't say, just soon." Martha twisted her hands together. "Mr. Crow, this is my fault. I shouldn't have sent those letters to the territorial governor asking for help with the gangs. I gave them a paper trail connecting you to violence in this region. You did what you thought was right. No one blames you." Elias turned back to face them. "We prepare the same way we prepared for Crane. We control the narrative. We present united testimony. We make sure the truth is documented and witnessed." "And if the marshal is bought?" Clara asked. "If Crane's employer has already paid for a particular outcome, then we deal with that when it happens." But dealing with it proved more complicated than any of them anticipated. The marshal arrived 3 days later, not alone, but with a detachment of 8 armed deputies and a court stenographer who looked terrified to be in what he clearly considered hostile territory. Marshal William Cord was in his 50s, with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice to harbor many illusions about human nature. He set up operations in the rebuilt community hall and immediately began interviewing townspeople individually, separating them to prevent coordinated stories. It was professional work, The kind that made Elias uneasy because it suggested Cord was actually trying to find the truth rather than simply rubber stamping a predetermined conclusion. Clara was interviewed first, at her own insistence. She spent 2 hours in the hall with Cord while his stenographer's pencil scratched endlessly across paper. When she emerged, her expression was carefully neutral. "He's good," she told Elias quietly. "Asked questions I didn't expect, caught 2 minor inconsistencies in my timeline. Nothing serious, but he noticed. Is he honest? I think so, but that might be worse for us. An honest marshal follows evidence, and the evidence could be interpreted multiple ways." Thomas Wright was next, then Sarah Chen, then Peter Hayes. The interviews continued for 2 full days, Cord methodically building a picture of events from multiple perspectives. He examined the burned remains of buildings, measured distances, studied sight lines. He rode out to the collapsed bridge and the western ridge where the landslide had occurred, examining both sites with the careful attention of someone who understood tactics and terrain. On the 3rd day, he called Elias in. The community hall was cold despite the fire burning in the new stone fireplace. Cord sat behind a simple wooden table, his stenographer to his left, a stack of testimony pages to his right. He gestured for Elias to sit across from him. "Mr. Crow? Or should I call you Mr. Carver?" Elias felt ice settle in his stomach, but kept his expression neutral. "Crow is the name I use now. Names are interesting things on the frontier. People reinvent themselves, leave pasts behind, become whoever they need to be to survive." Cord leaned back in his chair. "I've been a marshal for 23 years. I've seen a lot of reinvention, most of it innocent, people escaping debt, bad marriages, petty crimes they've served time for. But sometimes the names hide darker histories." "What's your question, Marshal?" "My question is this. Who were you before you became Elias Crow, and does that past have bearing on what happened here?" "I was a professional killer. I worked for wealthy men who needed problems removed discreetly. I was very good at it." Elias met Cord's eyes steadily. "I walked away from that life 8 years ago. I came here to find peace, to build something different. But the skills don't disappear just because you want them to." The stenographer's pencil had stopped moving. Cord made a small gesture, and the scratching resumed. "You're admitting to being a hired assassin." "I'm stating a fact, yes. And when the Garrett gang came to Stillwater, when Victor Crane brought his force, you used those skills to defend this town." "Yes." 15 men died. 15 men came here to kill civilians for money. They made their choice. I made mine." Cord was silent for a long moment, studying Elias with an intensity that would have made most men uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke again. "I've read the testimonies. Everyone tells the same basic story, with minor variations that suggest honesty rather than rehearsed lies. The physical evidence supports their claims. The buildings were clearly burned by accelerants brought from outside. The bridge collapse shows signs of both initial damage and secondary undermining. The Western Ridge landslide matches your description of prepared defenses." "Then you have your answer." "I have evidence of a battle. What I don't have is evidence of who started it, who escalated it, who had legal authority to use lethal force." Cord tapped the stack of papers. "These townspeople aren't soldiers. They're not law enforcement. They're civilians who took up arms against other civilians. That's vigilantism, Mr. Crow. And vigilantism, no matter how justified it feels, is illegal." "So you're saying we should have let Crane destroy the town? Let his employer take the land by force?" "I'm saying there are legal processes. Territorial governance, federal land courts, official channels for resolving disputes." Cord's voice was steady, not hostile but not friendly either. "You didn't use those channels. You chose violence." "The gangs chose violence. We chose survival." "From their perspective, you were an obstacle to legitimate business interests. Your presence here prevented peaceful negotiation." "Peaceful?" Clara's voice cut through the hall. She'd been sitting in the back listening, but now she stood and walked forward. "Marshal, I was there when Crane made his offer. He wasn't negotiating. He was demanding surrender or death. There was no legal process, no fair compensation, no protection for the townspeople's rights, just money and violence." Cord looked at her, then back at Elias. "Miss Vasquez, your testimony has been noted, but I'm curious about your role here. You arrived in Stillwater after the initial gang confrontations, but before the major battle. You're also a former professional in the same field as Mr. Crow. That suggests coordination, planning, perhaps even solicitation of violence. It suggests I came to help a friend who was facing impossible odds. Or it suggests two killers found common cause in manufacturing a situation that would justify their continued violence. Cord stood, pacing to the window. You see my problem? I have testimony from people defending their homes, but I also have 2 admitted professional killers at the center of events and 15 dead men who can't offer their version of the story. The room went silent except for the fire's crackling. The stenographer's pencil hovered over paper, waiting. Elias understood the calculation Cord was making. The marshal wasn't corrupt, wasn't bought, but he was trying to balance competing interests: the law, the truth, political pressure from wealthy interests, and the practical reality of frontier justice. The easiest solution would be to find Elias and Clara responsible, to separate them from the town's narrative, and prosecute them as rogue operators who'd escalated a manageable situation into a bloodbath. What do you want, Marshal? Elias asked quietly. I want the truth. The complete truth. Cord turned from the window. And I think there's more to this story than anyone's telling me. Crane's employer, for instance. I've asked repeatedly for his identity, and everyone suddenly develops convenient amnesia. That suggests fear. Who is he? Elias and Clara exchanged glances. They deliberately kept that information vague in their testimonies, understanding that naming names would bring new complications. But Cord was right. The employer was the missing piece that would make everything else make sense. His name is Harrison Blackwell, Elias said. He owns mining interests across 5 territories, has connections to railroad companies and territorial governors, and uses men like Crane to solve problems that can't be addressed through legal channels. Cord's expression shifted, just slightly. Harrison Blackwell. The Harrison Blackwell who just contributed $50,000 to the territorial governor's re-election campaign. The same. And you're telling me he hired Victor Crane to forcibly remove the people of Stillwater so he could exploit mineral deposits on their land? Yes. Cord sat back down heavily. That's a serious accusation against a very powerful man. It's also the truth. The marshal was silent for a long time, his fingers drumming on the table. Finally, he looked at his stenographer. Stop recording. Take a break. The young man fled the hall gratefully, leaving the 3 of them alone. Off the record, Cord said, you're probably right. I've heard stories about Blackwell, about how he operates. But proving it? Getting testimony that would stand in court? That's nearly impossible. Men who cross Blackwell tend to have unfortunate accidents. Witnesses disappear. Evidence gets lost. So you're saying he's untouchable, Clara said. I'm saying he's protected by wealth and influence that ordinary people can't fight through legal channels. Which brings us back to the original question. What do I do with you 2? Elias leaned forward. You document everything, every testimony, every piece of evidence, every detail of Crane's attack and Blackwell's involvement. You file it officially, make it part of the territorial record. Then you make a decision. Do you enforce laws that protect the powerful at the expense of the powerless? Or do you recognize that sometimes justice and law aren't the same thing? You're asking me to compromise my oath. I'm asking you to honor the spirit of that oath rather than just the letter. These people had no protection, no recourse, no options except to fight or die. They fought. They won. Punishing them for that doesn't serve justice. It serves men like Blackwell. Cord stared at him, and Elias could see the internal struggle playing out. This was a man who believed in law, who'd spent his career trying to bring order to a chaotic frontier. But he was also a man who'd seen enough to know that law without justice was just another form of tyranny. If I clear you, clear all of you, Blackwell will know, Cord said slowly. He'll bring political pressure. He might even come after me. Probably, Elias agreed. But you'll sleep better at night. The marshal actually smiled at that, though it was brief and bitter. Sleep is overrated on the frontier anyway. He stood, extending his hand. I'll file my report. It will state that the people of Stillwater acted in legitimate self-defense against an organized military assault by parties unknown. Victor Crane's name will appear as the field commander, but without direct evidence connecting him to Blackwell, that connection will remain speculation. Thank you, Marshal.
Don't thank me yet. This doesn't end the threat. Blackwell will try again. Different methods, different approaches. He wants this land, and men like him don't give up. We'll be ready. Cord nodded, then looked at Clara. Miss Vasquez, I strongly suggest you move on. Your presence here complicates things, creates the appearance of a professional operation rather than community self-defense. I'm not leaving, she said flatly. I thought you'd say that. Cord gathered his papers.
Then I suggest both of you keep low profiles. Don't give Blackwell or his people any new ammunition to use against you. He left the hall, his deputies following, and within 2 hours the entire detachment was riding south toward the territorial capital. Elias and Clara stood outside the community hall, watching them disappear. That was closer than it should have been, Clara said. But we survived it. This time. Cord was right, though. Blackwell won't stop. He's lost money, men, and reputation on this valley. Men like him don't accept that kind of defeat. She was proven right 3 weeks later when the first assassination attempt came. Elias was checking fence line on the eastern edge of his property when a bullet struck the post 2 inches from his head. He dropped instantly, rolling toward cover, his mind automatically calculating angles and trajectories. The shot had come from the northern ridge, approximately 400 yards. Long-range, difficult shot, missed because of wind or maybe because the shooter had rushed it. Amateur work. Or bait. Elias didn't return fire. Instead, he used the terrain to work his way back toward his ranch house, moving low and fast. When he reached cover, he found Clara already there, her rifle out, scanning the ridge through a telescope. One shooter, maybe 2, she reported. They're not moving, waiting to see if you panic or return fire. Blackwell's work? Has to be. Too coordinated to be random. Someone knew your routine, knew where you'd be today. She lowered the telescope. They're not trying to kill you, James. Not yet. This is reconnaissance. They want to see how you respond to pressure. Then we don't give them the satisfaction. They stayed in cover for 6 hours, while the shooter maintained position. Finally, as darkness fell, Clara spotted movement on the ridge. A single figure withdrawing, moving north toward where a horse was likely hidden. We could track them, she suggested. No, that's what they want. They attack, we chase. We expose ourselves to the real trap waiting further out. Elias cleaned his rifle methodically. They're testing our patterns, our responses. We need to be unpredictable. The attacks continued sporadically over the next month. Never the same method twice, never at times or places that could be anticipated. A fire started in Elias's barn at midnight, quickly extinguished because he'd installed an alarm system. Poisoned feed left in his grain stores, discovered because he'd started testing everything before use. A tripwire placed on the main trail between his ranch and town, detected and removed because he'd begun varying his routes. Each attempt was sophisticated but not quite lethal, designed to create stress, to force mistakes, to gather information about defenses and patterns. Blackwell was preparing something bigger. These pinprick attacks were just groundwork. The townspeople noticed. How could they not? Elias's increased security measures, Clara's constant vigilance, the way both of them had stopped sleeping on regular schedules, it all pointed to an ongoing threat that most civilians couldn't see but could certainly feel. Martha Henderson confronted them one evening in the general store, speaking quietly while George watched the street outside. People are scared again, she said. Not like before, not open terror, but underlying fear. They see you two constantly on edge, and they know something's coming. Something is, Clara confirmed. Blackwell hasn't given up. These small attacks are preparation for a major move. Then we need to end this, permanently. Martha's voice was harder than Elias had ever heard it. Can we? Is there a way to stop Blackwell directly? Remove the threat at its source? You're talking about assassination, Elias said flatly. I'm talking about survival. If he keeps sending men, keeps creating danger, eventually he'll succeed. Maybe not against you, but against the town, against innocent people who just want to live their lives. It was the same calculation Elias had made dozens of times in his previous life. Identify the source of the problem, remove it with surgical precision, let the ripple effects be someone else's concern. He'd been good at it, efficient, emotionless, but he wasn't that man anymore. Was he? Killing Blackwell would make him a martyr, Clara said. His business partners would investigate. His wealth would fund a massive manhunt, and we'd be murderers, not defenders. There's a line between protecting your home and hunting your enemies, and crossing it changes everything.
Then what do we do? Martha asked. Wait? Hope? Pray that eventually he gets bored and moves on? We make it expensive, Elias said. Every attack costs him money, men, resources. Eventually, the cost exceeds the value. That's how you defeat wealthy men. Make them choose between pride and profit. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't quite true.
Blackwell's attacks weren't just about profit anymore, they were about reputation.
Blackwell had been defied, defeated, humiliated by backwoods civilians.
That kind of wound to a wealthy man's ego didn't heal with time or cost-benefit analysis. The major attack came on a March morning when winter was finally beginning to release its grip on the valley. Elias was at his ranch, Clara was in town, and the space between them was suddenly filled with smoke and gunfire. The attackers, 12 men, professionals this time, hit both locations simultaneously.
4 struck Elias's ranch from multiple directions, while 8 rode into Stillwater firing indiscriminately, creating chaos and terror.
The coordination suggested significant planning, but it also revealed something crucial. Blackwell's people still thought they were fighting the battle from months ago. They expected the same defenses, the same tactics, the same passive population. They were wrong on all counts. Elias had spent the winter creating new defensive positions, new angles of fire, new methods of response. When the attackers came, they found not a single defender but a web of overlapping fields of fire, hidden positions, and automated responses that didn't require his physical presence. Bells connected to tripwires rang across his property, pinpointing attacker positions. Mirrors positioned in tree branches created confusion about where shots were originating, and Elias himself moved through terrain he'd mapped so thoroughly he could navigate it blindfolded, always one step ahead of pursuit. He didn't kill all 4 attackers, just 2. The others broke and ran when they realized they were trapped in a killing ground designed by someone who understood violence at a level they couldn't match. In Stillwater, the response was different but equally effective. Clara had spent months training the townspeople not as soldiers but as coordinated responders. When the 8 riders came in shooting, they found the street seemingly empty. But from reinforced positions in buildings, from covered positions behind stone walls, townspeople returned fire with disciplined volleys. Not expert marksmanship, Clara had been realistic about their skill levels, but coordinated fire that created zones of danger no horse could safely cross. The attackers found themselves channeled into kill zones, forced into positions where retreat was their only option. Peter Hayes, using his carpenter skills, had modified several buildings with firing ports and reinforced corners. From these positions, he and Thomas Wright directed defensive fire that, while not deadly, was concentrated enough to shatter the attack's momentum. The attackers withdrew after 20 minutes, having achieved nothing except confirming that Stillwater was far more dangerous than Blackwell's intelligence had suggested. As the last rider disappeared south, Clara emerged from her position and did a quick casualty count. 1 townsperson with a minor shoulder wound, 2 horses killed, multiple buildings with bullet damage but nothing structural, 0 deaths on either side. At his ranch, Elias zip-tied the hands of 1 wounded attacker and left him propped against a tree with water and a note. Tell Blackwell this valley will break every force he sends. Tell him to count his losses and move on. By evening, both attacks had been repelled, and the defenders gathered in the community hall to assess and plan. The mood was different from after Crane's battle. Less triumphant, more grim. They'd won again, but everyone understood the larger pattern. "He'll keep coming," Thomas said. His face was pale. He'd killed his first man during the fight, a clean shot through a rider's chest that had dropped him instantly. Blackwell has more money than we can ever match. More men, more resources. But he's running out of professionals willing to risk it, Clara countered. Word spreads. This valley has defeated 2 major attacks and multiple smaller ones. Mercenaries talk, and right now Stillwater's reputation is growing faster than Blackwell's wallet can overcome. So we just wait? Sarah Chen asked. Keep fighting, keep surviving, until what? Until we're too old to fight? Until he finds a force big enough to overwhelm us? The question hung in the air, and Elias realized something he'd been avoiding. This couldn't continue indefinitely. Constant vigilance, constant threat, constant violence. It would break the community eventually, even if they won every battle. They needed to end this permanently. But how? The answer came from an unexpected source. Marshal Cord returned to Stillwater 2 weeks after the simultaneous attacks. But this time he came alone and at night, riding straight to Elias's ranch with urgency in every movement. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Privately. About Harrison Blackwell and how to end this without more bloodshed." Inside Elias's ranch house, lit only by the fireplace and a single lamp, Marshal Cord spread documents across the table with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from anger barely contained. "I've been investigating Blackwell since I left here," Cord began. Quietly. "Using contacts, favors owed, information networks most lawmen don't acknowledge exist. What I found," he paused, organizing his thoughts. "Harrison Blackwell isn't just a mining magnate. He's built an empire on theft, murder, and manipulation that spans 8 territories. The land here in Stillwater? It's just one piece of a pattern that's been playing out for 15 years. Clara had joined them, arriving through the back entrance as she always did when meetings required discretion. She studied the documents, her expression darkening with each page. "These are land surveys, mineral assessments, death certificates," she said, "all connected to Blackwell's acquisitions."
Exactly. Towns that refused to sell had mysterious fires. Ranchers who wouldn't negotiate had fatal accidents. Territorial officials who investigated too closely either took bribes or disappeared. Cord tapped one document in particular. "This is the pattern. Blackwell identifies valuable land, makes lowball offers, escalates to violence when refused, then uses his political connections to legitimize his claims after the original owners are gone." "How many times?" Elias asked. "That I can document?" 14. "How many, actually? Probably double that." Cord looked at them both with exhausted eyes. "I've been a marshal for over 2 decades. I've seen frontier justice, range wars, mining disputes. But Blackwell operates on a different scale. He's not a criminal. He's a system. And systems are nearly impossible for individuals to fight." "Nearly," Clara repeated, "but not completely. That's why I'm here." Cord pulled out a final document, this one covered in dense legal language. "Blackwell made a mistake with Stillwater. He moved too fast, too aggressively. His normal pattern is to be patient, to let situations develop naturally over years. But your resistance, Crow, it made him angry. Anger makes men sloppy." "What mistake?" Elias leaned forward. "He filed mineral claims on this land before the attacks. Premature filings that assume ownership he doesn't legally have. Those filings are public record, and they establish intent. Combined with testimony about the attacks, about Crane's involvement, about the systematic campaign against Stillwater, I can build a case that might actually reach federal courts." "Federal courts that Blackwell probably has in his pocket," Clara said skeptically. "Some, yes, but not all. There are judges, prosecutors, politicians who've been waiting for someone to challenge Blackwell with actual evidence. The problem has always been that evidence disappears, witnesses recant, cases fall apart before they reach trial." Cord met Elias's eyes. "But you two are different. You're not intimidated civilians. You're professionals who understand violence and aren't afraid to face it. If you're willing to testify, to stand as witnesses in federal court, we might actually have a chance." Elias absorbed this. Going to federal court meant exposure, meant his past as James Carver would become public record, meant whatever peace he'd found in this valley would evaporate completely. "If we do this," he said slowly, "Blackwell will know we're coming. He'll escalate before the case can be heard." "Probably. Which is why we need to move fast and we need leverage that protects you during the process." Cord pulled out another document. "I've been working with a federal prosecutor named Catherine Shaw. She's based in Denver, has a reputation for going after powerful men, and she's been trying to build a case against Blackwell for 3 years. If we can get you to Denver, get your testimony on record with protections in place, we can force this into the open where Blackwell's usual methods won't work." "What kind of protections?" Clara asked. "Federal custody during the trial, armed guards, sealed testimony until the hearing. It's not perfect, but it's better than staying here and waiting for Blackwell's next attack to succeed." The 3 of them sat in silence, weighing options. Finally, Clara spoke. "I don't like it. Too many variables, too much trust placed in systems that have failed before, but..." She looked at Elias.
It might be the only way to actually end this without killing Blackwell ourselves. Which would make us murderers, Elias said, and give his allies justification for retaliation against Stillwater. So we go legal. We testify. We trust the system. Clara's smile was bitter. Never thought I'd say those words. Neither did I. Elias looked at Cord. When do we leave? Tomorrow. Before dawn. The longer we wait, the more chance Blackwell's network gets wind of this and moves to stop it. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Elias wrote letters to Martha Henderson explaining where he was going and why, giving her authority to make decisions about the ranch in his absence. Clara packed minimally, one bag, essential weapons hidden in ways that looked innocent. They both understood this might be a one-way trip, that testifying against Harrison Blackwell could end with them dead in some Denver alley regardless of federal protections. But it was the right move. The only move that offered a chance at permanent resolution instead of endless cycles of violence. They left 2 hours before sunrise, 3 riders moving through darkness toward a railroad depot 40 miles south. Cord had arranged for a private car, paid for with federal funds, and guarded by deputies he personally trusted. The journey to Denver would take 3 days, assuming no one interfered. Interference came on the second day. They were crossing through a narrow mountain pass when the attack hit. Not subtle this time, not reconnaissance or probing. This was a full assault, 15 riders with military precision, clearly informed about their route and timing. Blackwell had learned they were moving and had committed everything to stopping them. The first shots came from elevated positions on both sides of the pass. Cord's deputies returned fire, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Within minutes, 2 deputies were down and the others were pinned behind their train car. Elias and Clara moved as one, their old partnership reasserting itself without conscious thought. She went high, climbing to the train car's roof to provide covering fire. He went low, using the terrain to flank the attackers on the eastern slope. This was the killing ground they both knew intimately. Chaos, violence, split-second decisions between life and death. And despite everything Elias had done to leave this life behind, he felt the old certainty settle over him like a familiar coat. He killed 3 men in the first 2 minutes. Not because he wanted to, but because they were between him and the survival of something that mattered. Each shot was precise, efficient, without malice or hesitation. Professional work. Claire's rifle spoke from above, controlling the western slope. Her shots were equally precise, equally cold. Together, they created a devastating crossfire that the attackers hadn't anticipated. But there were too many. For every man that fell, another took his place. And these weren't the scared mercenaries from previous attacks. These were Blackwell's best, men who'd been promised fortunes to stop the witnesses from reaching Denver. Cord was hit in the shoulder but kept firing, his face twisted in pain and determination. Another deputy went down. The situation was deteriorating fast. Then, from behind the attackers, new gunfire erupted. Elias risked a glance and saw something that stopped his breath. Riders coming hard from the south, at least 20 of them, firing into the attackers' rear positions. It took him a moment to recognize them. Thomas Wright in the lead, Peter Hayes beside him, followed by townspeople from Stillwater and ranchers from the surrounding valleys. People who'd seen Cord's party pass through, who'd noticed the deputy's tension, who'd followed out of loyalty or curiosity, or simply because they understood that Elias and Clara were fighting for all of them. The attackers, caught between 2 forces, broke. Some tried to surrender, others fled into the mountains. Within 10 minutes, the pass was secure, and the ambush had failed. Thomas dismounted, his rifle still smoking, his face pale but resolute. Figured you might need backup. Turns out we figured right. You shouldn't have come, Elias said, but there was gratitude in his voice. This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. Peter Hayes checked his ammunition, reloading with practiced efficiency. Blackwell comes after you. He comes after all of us. We're done hiding behind others. We're done being victims. Martha Henderson rode up. Elias hadn't even seen her in the group, and dismounted with surprising grace for someone who ran a general store. Mr. Crow, you've protected us how many times now? You think we'd let you face this alone? We're not that ungrateful? The combined force continued to Denver, now 30 strong instead of 8. Blackwell's people tried twice more to interfere, but both attempts were smaller, less organized. The word had spread. Stillwater wasn't just one or two fighters anymore. It was a community that had learned to defend itself. They reached Denver on a cold April morning, riding into the city like an army returning from war. Federal prosecutor Catherine Shaw met them at her office, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who looked at the armed crowd and raised an eyebrow. "Marshal Cord, you said you were bringing 2 witnesses. This looks like an invasion." "Witnesses with support, ma'am. Figured it was safer that way." Shaw studied Elias and Clara with professional assessment. "You're the ones who've been holding off Blackwell's forces in Montana. I've read Cord's reports. Impressive work, though technically illegal in about a dozen ways." "We did what we had to," Elias replied. "Are you going to prosecute us or use us?" "Both, probably. But let's start with using you." She gestured them inside. "I've been building a case against Harrison Blackwell for years. I have documents, financial records, testimony from other victims. What I didn't have was anyone willing to stand in open court and testify about his pattern of violence. Most witnesses recant or disappear before trial." "We won't recant," Clara said flatly. "And you won't disappear?" "People have tried to make us disappear. It hasn't worked out well for them." Shaw actually smiled at that. "Good, because Blackwell knows you're here. He filed an emergency injunction this morning trying to block any testimony, claiming it would violate his rights to face his accusers privately. The judge denied it, which means we're going to trial tomorrow. Public, recorded, with every word documented for federal record." "That fast?" Cord asked. "Blackwell's lawyers want to move quickly, probably thinking they can overwhelm us with legal maneuvering. They don't realize we've been preparing for this for 3 years." Shaw's smile turned cold. "Tomorrow morning, we put Harrison Blackwell on trial for conspiracy, murder for hire, and systematic land fraud. And if your testimony holds up, Mr. Crow and Miss Vasquez, we're going to destroy him." The trial began at 9 o'clock the following morning in Denver's federal courthouse. The gallery was packed with journalists, curious citizens, and Blackwell's allies who'd come to watch the prosecution fail. Harrison Blackwell himself sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed, radiating confidence and barely contained contempt. He was 62, silver-haired, with the kind of face that looked trustworthy in photographs and ruthless in person. When his eyes met Elias's across the courtroom, there was no pretense of civility, just cold calculation and the promise of future violence. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. Financial records showing Blackwell's companies filing mineral claims on land they didn't own. Death certificates of landowners who'd refused to sell, all listing accident or natural causes, despite suspicious circumstances. Testimony from surveyors who'd been pressured to falsify reports. Then Catherine Shaw called Elias Crow to the stand. The courtroom went absolutely silent as Elias was sworn in. Shaw's questioning was precise, building the story piece by piece. Who he was, why he'd come to Stillwater, what had happened with the gangs and Crane's attack. Blackwell's attorney, a polished man named Vincent Harrow, who charged $500 a day, cross-examined aggressively. "Mr. Crow, isn't it true that you're a former assassin? A professional killer who's murdered dozens of people for money?" "Yes." The admission shocked the courtroom. Harrow smiled, sensing blood. "And isn't it true that you came to Stillwater specifically to create a situation where you could use violence? That you manufactured this conflict to justify your continued killing?" "No. I came to Stillwater to escape that life. The conflict came to me." "Convenient. And when it did, you killed 15 men." 15. Does that sound like someone trying to escape violence or someone addicted to it? Elias met Harrow's eyes steadily. "Those 15 men came to murder civilians for money. They were professionals, just like I used to be. The difference is I was defending people who couldn't defend themselves. They were attacking people who'd done nothing wrong except refuse to surrender their homes." "Your Honor, this witness is clearly biased." "Your Honor," Shaw interrupted, "the defense is attempting to distract from the central question. Mr. Crow's past doesn't change the facts of what happened in Stillwater. Harrison Blackwell hired Victor Crane to remove the town's population by force. That's conspiracy to commit murder. The witness's history is irrelevant to that fact." The judge, an elderly man named Thornton who'd seen every courtroom trick twice, sustained Shaw's objection. Clara's testimony followed, corroborating Elias's account, and adding details about Crane's methods and Blackwell's pattern of operations. Then came Marshal Cord, providing official validation of the evidence. But the prosecution's most devastating witness was someone no one expected. Victor Crane himself walked into the courtroom in chains, escorted by federal marshals, and took the stand. The entire defense table went pale. Blackwell leaned forward, his confident facade cracking for the first time. Shaw approached the witness stand with barely contained triumph. "Mr. Crane, would you please tell the court about your professional relationship with Harrison Blackwell?"
Crane, looking older and more worn than when Elias had last seen him, spoke in a clear, measured voice. "I've worked for Harrison Blackwell for 8 years. My job was to remove obstacles to his business interests using whatever methods were necessary. Sometimes that meant intimidation, sometimes bribery, sometimes murder." He looked directly at Blackwell. Stillwater was supposed to be simple. Drive out the residents, make it look natural, allow Blackwell to claim the land legally once it was abandoned, but the plan failed because of Elias Crow and the community's resistance. "Why are you testifying today?" Shaw asked. "Because I was promised immunity and witness protection. And because after Stillwater I realized I'd become something I despised. A tool for men who see human lives as numbers on a balance sheet. Blackwell abandoned his own men when they became inconvenient. He'd have done the same to me eventually." Crane's voice hardened. "So I'm making sure he goes down first." The testimony continued for 3 more days. Each witness, each document, each piece of evidence built an undeniable picture of systematic criminality. Blackwell's attorneys fought brilliantly, challenging every detail, questioning every motive. But the sheer weight of evidence was overwhelming. On the 4th day, the jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Journalists rushed for doors, trying to be first with the story. Blackwell's allies sat in stunned silence, and Blackwell himself for the first time showed genuine emotion, rage so pure it seemed to heat the air around him. "This isn't over," he said, loud enough to carry across the courtroom. "I have resources you can't imagine. I have connections that reach—" "You have nothing," Judge Thornton interrupted coldly. "Your assets are being seized as proceeds of criminal activity. Your companies are being dissolved. Your political allies are fleeing your association as fast as they can hire lawyers. You, Harrison Blackwell, are finished." The sentence was pronounced: 30 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. As marshals led Blackwell away in chains, his eyes found Elias one last time. The hatred there was palpable, but underneath it was something else. Defeat. Complete and permanent defeat. Outside the courthouse, the Stillwater contingent celebrated quietly. They'd won not just a battle, but a war. Blackwell's empire was collapsing, his network exposed, his methods revealed to public scrutiny that would prevent anyone from using his tactics again, at least not on the same scale. Martha Henderson hugged Elias with tears streaming down her face. "It's really over. We can go home and it's actually over." "It's over," he confirmed. But as the celebration continued, Clara pulled Elias aside away from the crowd. "What now?" she asked. "You've done what you set out to do. Protected the town, brought down the threat. You could leave now, disappear, start over somewhere new." Elias looked at the people of Stillwater. Thomas Wright sharing whiskey with Peter Hayes, Sarah Chen laughing at something George Henderson said, Martha organizing travel arrangements with characteristic efficiency. These weren't just people he'd protected. They were people who'd become something he'd never had before. Family. "I'm staying," he said. "Stillwater needs rebuilding, real rebuilding this time. And He paused, finding words for feelings he wasn't used to acknowledging. "I need them too. Turns out solitude isn't the same as peace." Clara smiled, and it was warm and genuine in ways her smiles rarely were. "Good, because I'm staying too. Someone needs to keep you from getting too soft." They returned to Stillwater a week later, the entire group traveling together like returning heroes. But there was no parade, no grand celebration, just quiet satisfaction and the immediate work of continuing what they'd started. The town's reconstruction accelerated with new purpose. Peter Hayes designed buildings that were both beautiful and functional, architecture that spoke of permanence and community rather than mere survival. Thomas Wright organized ranchers from surrounding valleys into a cooperative that would prevent any single entity from dominating the region's economy.
Martha and George Henderson expanded the general store, adding a lending library and a small schoolroom. Stillwater was becoming more than it had been before. Not just a town, but a statement. A declaration that ordinary people, properly organized and defending something worth protecting, could stand against any threat. Elias worked his ranch with new attention, no longer seeing it as a hiding place, but as a home. Clara purchased land adjacent to his and started her own operation, close enough to coordinate defenses, but far enough to maintain independence. They trained townspeople not as soldiers, but as a militia that understood the difference between violence and defense. 6 months after the trial, a different kind of visitor arrived in Stillwater. Not a threat this time, but a young woman with a notebook and determination in her eyes. "My name is Rebecca Chen," she told Elias when she found him mending fence. "I'm a journalist from San Francisco. I'm writing a story about how frontier communities defend themselves against corporate predation. Stillwater's story is exactly what readers need to hear." "We're not heroes," Elias said. "We just refuse to give up what was ours." "That's exactly what makes it heroic. You showed that ordinary people can fight back, can win, can build something lasting." She paused. "Will you tell me the story? The real story, not the sanitized version in the trial transcripts?" Elias considered. Then slowly, he began to talk. About the gangs, about Crane, about Blackwell and the trial. But also about the fear, the doubts, the moments when victory seemed impossible. He talked about Clara's arrival, about the townspeople's courage, about Peter Hayes choosing redemption over revenge. He talked until the sun set, until the story was told as fully as he could tell it. Rebecca Chen's article ran 3 months later in papers across the country. It sparked a movement. Other towns began organizing defensive cooperatives, began documenting corporate intimidation, began fighting back against the Harrison Blackwells of the world, using both legal and practical means. Stillwater became a symbol. And symbols, Elias learned, carried their own weight and responsibility. More visitors came, some seeking help organizing their own defenses, some looking for Elias specifically, wanting to learn from the man who'd held off armies. He turned away most of them, but a few, the ones who showed genuine commitment to protecting their communities rather than seeking glory, he helped. Clara worked with him, training, advising, sharing hard-won knowledge. They became teachers without meaning to, passing on skills that had once been used for darker purposes. 2 years after Blackwell's conviction, Elias stood on the ridge above his ranch and surveyed the valley. Stillwater had doubled in size, new buildings spreading in carefully planned patterns. The population had grown from 200 to nearly 500 as word spread about the town that had defended itself and won. Clara joined him, as she often did these quiet mornings, bringing coffee and comfortable silence. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Staying, building this, trading the life we had for this one?" Elias thought about it honestly. The life they'd had, the violence, the freedom, the simplicity of problems solved with precision and force, had its appeal. No complications, no attachments, no weight of caring what happened to anyone except yourself. But it had also been empty, a life of moments strung together without meaning, without purpose beyond the next job, the next target, the next disappearance. "No regrets," he said. "This is harder, but it matters more." "Yeah." Clara sipped her coffee, watching the sunrise paint the valley in gold and amber. "It does." That afternoon, a rider arrived from the territorial capital with news that made the entire town gather in celebration. The territorial governor, a new one, elected after Blackwell's conviction had exposed the previous governor's corruption, had officially recognized Stillwater's mineral rights. The land was theirs, legally and permanently, with protections that prevented future corporate claims. More than that, the governor had created a fund, built partially from Blackwell's seized assets, to help frontier communities develop defensive infrastructure and legal protections against predatory business practices. Stillwater would receive the first grant. The celebration lasted 3 days. But on the 4th morning, Elias woke to find Clara already dressed and packing. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Wyoming. There's a town there, similar situation to what we faced here. They reached out, asked for help." She finished packing, then turned to face him. "You coming?" He should say no. He had responsibilities here, a ranch to run, a community that relied on him. But he also understood that staying in one place forever, letting skills atrophy, forgetting the lessons that had kept him alive, that was its own kind of death. For how long? A month? Maybe 2? Just long enough to teach them what they need to know. Clara's smile was challenging. Unless you've gotten too comfortable with peace and quiet. I'll tell Martha we're leaving tomorrow. They rode out of Stillwater a week later, heading north into mountains still capped with snow. Behind them, the town continued its work, building, growing, becoming something permanent. Ahead of them, new challenges waited, new communities needing the kind of protection only people who'd lived through hell could provide. It became their pattern over the next 5 years. They'd stay in Stillwater for months at a time, helping with major projects, training new defenders, maintaining the infrastructure of protection they'd built. Then they'd leave for weeks or months, traveling to other towns, other valleys, wherever people needed help standing against those who'd take by force what couldn't be won by right. They became legends in their own way, though neither sought the recognition. The ghosts of Montana, some called them. The guardians. The ones who taught us to fight back. Elias preferred simpler terms. He was a rancher who happened to have particular skills. Clara was his partner in business and protection and the quiet understanding that came from shared history. Together, they'd found something neither had believed possible: purpose without emptiness, violence without corruption, strength used in service rather than domination. On a spring morning, 10 years after the day Elias had first confronted the Garrett gang in Stillwater Street, he sat on his porch watching the valley wake. He was older now, lines deeper around his eyes, gray threading his hair. Clara was due back from a 3-month stint helping a mining community in Colorado. The ranch was prospering, the town was thriving, and for the first time in his adult life, Elias felt something approaching contentment. Then he saw the rider coming fast from the south, and old instincts flared to life. But this wasn't a threat. It was Thomas Wright, older himself now, with a family and his own successful ranch, riding with urgency but not panic. "Elias," he called out, "you need to see this. Everyone's gathering in town. There's news from the territorial capital." Montana was becoming a state. After years of territorial governance, after corruption had been rooted out and new systems built, statehood was finally happening. And Stillwater, the little town that had defied Harrison Blackwell and sparked a movement of community self-defense across the frontier, was being recognized in the state's founding documents. The valley where ordinary people had stood against overwhelming force and won was being enshrined as a symbol of what the new state would stand for. The celebration that night was different from past ones. Not frantic relief or exhausted triumph, but genuine joy. Children who'd been born in Stillwater after the battles played in streets rebuilt stronger than before. Adults who'd fought raised glasses to those who'd fallen and those who'd survived. And Elias, standing at the edge of it all as he preferred, felt Clara's hand slip into his. "We did this," she said quietly. "Not just survived it, built it." "They did this," he corrected, gesturing to the townspeople. "We just held the line until they could. Doesn't matter who gets credit. It matters that it's real, that it's lasting, that what we built here will outlive us both." She was right. Stillwater would endure long after they were gone, a testament to the idea that communities protecting themselves with courage and intelligence could stand against any threat. Late that night, after the celebrations had quieted and people had returned to their homes, Elias walked to the ridge one final time. The valley stretched below him, lights flickering in windows, smoke rising from chimneys, life continuing in all its ordinary beauty. He'd come to this place seeking silence, seeking an ending. What he'd found was something else entirely. A beginning, a purpose, a home worth defending, and people worth dying for. The darkness below wasn't empty anymore. It was full of life, of possibility, of futures being built by people who'd learned that standing together made them stronger than any individual could ever be. And standing watch over it all, unseen but always present, were the ghosts who'd become guardians. The killers who'd learned that their skills could protect as well as destroy, that violence in defense of community was different from violence in service of greed. Elias Crow, once James Carver, stood in the Montana night and understood finally that he'd found what he'd been seeking all along. Not peace in the absence of conflict, but peace in the knowledge that when conflict came, he could face it alongside people who mattered, for reasons worth fighting for. The valley was his home now. These people were his family.
and whatever threats emerged from the darkness beyond, they would face them together.
The predators might still prowl the edges, testing, probing, seeking weakness. But this land didn't fear them anymore, because it had learned something that predators never understood. The strongest defense wasn't walls or weapons or individual skill. It was community, purpose. People who'd chosen to stand together and refused to be moved. And that was a fortress no force on earth could breach.